But I suspect I'd have every faith that in the long run, in a broad trade war of this type of protectionism, the United States is perfectly placed to win it.
Hello, and welcome to this week's Omnibus edition of Spectator TV. Now, before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. First up this week, Trump ignited a trade war that was over before it began. Kate Andrews and Freddy Gray are joined by SDP leader William Coulson to debate the logic behind Trump's tariffs.
Seems to be very bad news if you talk to anyone who knows about the city, talks about the city, writes about the city. How disastrous is it, do you think?
We can probably extend that further. Economists on the left and right don't tend to agree on much. They tend to think that rent controls are a bad idea, and they tend to think that free trade is a pretty good thing. So tariffs of this size have terrified quite a lot of people, not least because Donald Trump has slapped. Is that the lingo? Yeah.
You have to say slapped.
You have to say slapped.
Can't say imposed.
Certainly not. Not even levied. He has slapped tariffs on his neighbors to the north and the south at 25% on the goods coming into the country, an additional 10% on China. To compare this to what he did in his first term, it makes those first 4 years look like a quite mild warm-up to what we're seeing now, and nobody is quite prepared for just the incredible global impact that this is potentially going to have. Now, Donald Trump might say you should be prepared because I was talking about it for my entire election campaign. But if you spoke to people who were close to Team Trump or in Trump world, they would say, no, this is all a negotiation tactic. And I think what's particularly confused and confounded markets, and we're seeing that today as the stock market dips all over, is that people really did think there was going to be more of a negotiating process, that it wasn't going to be almost immediately into Trump's first term that he was going to slap these tariffs on his neighbors. And the next question is, how much further does this go? He's saying that the EU is in his sights for the first time in a long time. He's talking about the UK. We can come on to what it might mean for the bloc and what it might mean for the Labour government later. But this is a pretty monumental moment, and you can tell that Trump is enjoying it for the most part. I think he sees these outcries as just more confirmation that he has crushed his critics and he has defied consensus once again. The question is whether or not it's going to work. And this is all on Donald Trump's shoulders because he's decided to use executive orders. He hasn't gone through Congress. If prices do start to drift up quite dramatically for the American people, that's going to very much be at odds with his other promise to bring prices down for the American people. We know he loves tariffs. Perhaps people should have been better prepared. But the consequences are definitely going to be for Trump to own.
William, Donald Trump thinks that the economic orthodoxy on tariffs is just wrong, and that his tariffs will not be inflationary, and that they will just make America richer, and they will force allies to behave in a proper way towards America, or suffer consequences. Is he entirely wrong, or do you think he's right?
I think he's broadly right, actually. And the first thing I'd say about what he's done, yes, it's very abrupt, but it does represent a political victory. It represents a political victory among the type of people that have been arguing for this within the Trump coalition. Obviously, it's a bit like the Brexit coalition, isn't this? It's quite large. But the people that have been arguing for a degree of protectionism, the people that are very critical of running constant, large, persistent trade deficits, people like Bob Lighthizer and Steve Bannon, actually, have won the day. So whatever happens economically, politically, this is a victory. I don't see it as transitory. I think the world is turning into a more protectionist phase. So I think it won't be. It was very, very interesting to watch Poilievre's. Poilievre almost certainly will be Canada's leader soon. And his reaction was very much Canada first. And all of his emphasis in reaction to these abrupt tariffs on an ally was to say, how can we make Canada more resilient? How can we build up our own industry? Which is exactly the right response. I think I've argued for years that we're far too indifferent to what is made where and by whom, and far too indifferent to who owns what. So I think it'll be messy, Freddie. I think there'll be a bit of blood on the floor. I don't actually think it'll be inflationary. I'll explain why if you like. But I think in the long run, he will probably win, largely because he is a deficit country. The people that have a great deal to lose are the surplus economies.
But I suppose the way in which it might backfire for Trump, William, is that if other countries start to think of themselves first, that could be disadvantageous to a global economy that has, in many ways, benefited America. I know that there's a lot of people in America who don't feel the benefits, and that's why Trump is popular, and so on. But the fact is, the American economy dominates the global economy because of unprotectionist measures in other countries.
I'm not sure I agree with you. From America's point of view, it depends whether you think it matters. I'll go back to this point of running persistent trade deficits. Go back to the basic trade economics. You can pay for your imports by exporting something or by selling assets or by issuing debt. So if you constantly run these huge deficits, you will just on the maths get poorer. And I'm not putting an ideology forward. I'm just making a basic point about mathematics. So the people that think that's important, and also the people that have noticed that if you get on the train at Penn Station, you get on Philly, and you see factory after factory closed and despoiled, and you see your industry gutted, that's had a cost to workers. And people are inclined, particularly economists, are inclined to forget about the fact that it's political economy, right? So who are the winners and losers? Well, the blue-collar workers, the industrial workers, the former industrial workers, the towns, the cities that used to be productive in the United States and in the UK, that are now opioid centers and full of dysfunction and underclass, they've paid the price. I think what's happened is, that's why I said at the start, it's a political victory for the people that want to stand up for those citizens. And I think they're right to do so. I think in the long run, I think it probably will be massive. In the long run, they'll probably be better off.
Kate, it's all about deficits, ledgers of deficits.
I don't think we can be terribly surprised that the world's richest country is importing more, consuming more, and interested in more choice, and thus has a trade deficit with large parts of the world because it's Americans that want to buy the products. The problem with tariffs, and this is where Donald Trump has been misleading. I think regardless of whether or not you agree with his philosophy, this is where the president has been misleading. He insists that other countries pay the price. Now, they might feel pain. They might pay a different kind of price, but it's going to be American companies that are paying these costs, and they're going to pass it on to the consumer. And I think this is where things get muddled, because his vice president, J.D. Vance, makes the philosophical case for tariffs, and he addresses this point. He doesn't hide it. He did a big interview, I think, with the New York Times last year, where they said, what do you think about taxes? And he said, well, tariffs are taxes, and that's the kind of, I'm paraphrasing here, tariffs are taxes, and that's the kind of tax I would like to see go up. I think it's the Tax Foundation in America that has calculated that this new lot of tariffs is going to cost your average American household hundreds of pounds more a year. There are people like J.D. Vance who might be willing to say that is a trade-off I'm willing to make if it advances American industry, if it advances the American worker. Those are big ifs. I mean, American industry now relies so much on imports, even in its own manufacturing, to make these products. So the idea that, you're going to get through this without pain, and even Donald Trump now admits there's going to be some pain, isn't going to happen. But Donald Trump has never really made that case. Donald Trump has always implied that his tariffs are a negotiating tactic because he loves to oversee economies that are booming. He loves to be the guy that makes you richer, that makes you feel better off. And that is where tariffs get much, much trickier, because he has promised in the same campaign to bring down the cost of food. Well, about 2/3 of vegetables consumed in America are imported from Mexico. He's promising to bring down the cost of energy. A real way that Canada can retaliate is with its crude oil, which America heavily relies upon. He's promised to bring down prices whilst going for these huge tariffs. And I think that's a difficult area for the president. He's never really made the philosophical commitment to the impact of tariffs. It's more for him the negotiating tactic. And then the question is, well, what do you want to get out of this? And I think William's completely right to point out that we shouldn't be indifferent. But Canada, for example, has got to be baffled by why it is in this grouping with Mexico and China. Donald Trump is talking about cracking down on illegal immigration and fentanyl. Now, illegal immigration from Canada has been rising, but not nearly at the levels, not even close to what we've seen from Mexico. Same goes for the transportation of drugs. So why you would do this almost universally is a big question. And it also raises huge questions for the EU and for the UK. On paper, the US actually has a trade surplus with the UK, and yet Donald Trump, although he said he thinks tariffs can be avoided, is bringing the UK into the mix. This gives a sense that there isn't really a coherent strategy yet behind the tariffs, except from what we already know from the previous term of Donald Trump, is that he thinks if he uses them, he can get more of his way. And that might be true, but that's why when William talks about the political win, it's certainly a win for a certain kind of protectionist ideology. It's just one that Trump has never fully articulated. And I think for Trump, the political win is getting other countries to bend to his will, whether that be on immigration, perhaps defense and NATO spending. That could be a big part of tariffs on the EU. And that's yet to be seen, and we may not see the changes for some time.
William, do you want to respond to that? And particularly this point, I think, that is quite interesting, that Donald Trump seems to be advancing a sort of national capitalism, whereas J.D. Vance and voices like that are perhaps more in the social democratic model, which you would align yourself with.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm much more on aligned with Vance. I think Vance is the real deal. I think he gets it. So philosophically, I think there's more underpinning, let's say, there. And I agree. I think it's slightly erratic. I mean, it's slightly puzzling to lash out at Canada. If you strip out hydrocarbons going south from Canada to the States, that the trade is pretty much in balance. So it's slightly odd. But just to nail this question about inflation, because the people that hate the idea of tariffs are always going to say it's going to be terrible, the outcome is dreadful, it's going to be inflationary. Well, before coming on, I just had a look at the size of the economy in the States. So basically, consumption represents, goods consumption is about 31% of the economy, and imports is about 16%. The imports from the three countries he's nailed now represent about 7% of GDP. So look, prices might go up. They won't go up, of course, on all products affected by the tariffs, because some products will be quite inelastic, some will be elastic. It depends. And actually, in the long run, a point you've made, Freddy, is that some will be substituted by domestic production. That's exactly what Vance and Trump probably want. But it's too early to say yet. But I suspect I'd have every faith that in the long run, in a broad trade war of this type of protectionism, the United States is perfectly placed to win it.
Well, the next, and perhaps very quickly we'll be onto it, phase will be Europe. And as I understand, pharmaceuticals, America imports a lot of pharmaceuticals from Europe. And unless domestic production can plug that gap very quickly, that will mean, I assume, price rises for drugs in America, which is already a very expensive place medically. Drugs cost a lot of money in America. That could cause huge political pain very quickly, could it not, William?
Well, it could, but it's up to, it depends how blunt an instrument Trump wants to yield. It's up to him. You can put a different tariff on a different product if you want in different categories. So, it really is a matter for Trump. I think he's done it in a very crude way, a very quick way. Whether he repeats it and just slaps 25% on all EU trade with the United States, I don't know. But I get back to that. I make my point always on particular markets. One of the best ones to look at is Chinese EVs, electric vehicles. There's a price advantage in the market in Europe and the United States by Chinese EVs, about a third. Now, the public will buy them because they're a third cheaper. So my point is that if you sit there like a lemon, you will lose your entire automotive industry. Eventually, the Chinese will eat a lot. And the reason they'll eat a lot is that you practice free trade, but it's not fair trade. I don't think the conditions that Chinese workers have experienced are the same as the ones we have. I'm very critical of Britain, for instance, having no tariff at all on Chinese EVs. That's why you see so many on the streets. The European Union have a lower tariff against Chinese EVs than the United States, but actually Biden, influenced by Trump, has it right, 100%. So this is just sensible, in my opinion. I think a lot of the world, we've had sort of free trade liberal ideology dominating for 30, 40 years. And I think this is a real inflection point, and I'm very excited about it.
Kate, you're not excited about it. That's fair to say, isn't it?
I'm deeply worried that America is actually about to maybe not fall completely, but start to slip from its position of global power. And that might seem like a slightly odd thing to say given the current position it's in. But when America acts in this way towards its most important and closest allies, trust is lost quickly. I think countries like Russia and China's not happy right now with this 10% levy, right? But they look at the way that Donald Trump is talking about the European Union, is talking about Canada, of all places, mocking these countries, insulting these countries. And it's fundamentally a win for people who, as William just points out there, really don't respect human rights on the same level, really don't offer the same kind of important philosophical gains that the West has been able to bring to the world. And that makes me very nervous. And the decision to do it through what we know has actually lifted so many people out of poverty, has made us richer, has made us more prosperous, has made us more successful. To do it through the means of trade wars, to go after trade in this way, yeah, it is pretty baffling to me. But whenever Donald Trump does something that's baffling, I step back and I go, okay, why is he doing it? And I think William has articulated a lot of the reasons in which he's decided to go for this. The fact that there's so many American workers who are out of jobs, out of luck, have seen their communities crumple around them. And this is where J.D. Vance in his book, Hillbilly Elegy, is just so incredibly important. They're frustrated with that and they want to see a return to something. But Donald Trump tried to return a lot of that industry from 2017 onwards. He insisted he was going to make America this great manufacturing country again. And again, the tariffs ended up getting him some things he wanted at the margins. Ultimately, it didn't lead to that massive boom that he promised. Now, perhaps even bigger tariffs will, but I think the evidence is incredibly weak here. That the stronger evidence is that this is going to be an incredibly expensive project, certainly for the American people and for anybody who has to experience these tariffs. And again, I don't think the president is being completely honest or upfront about that. I mean, some of his comments are really funny and people are wrong to be so earnest about them. You know, the latest being that if you don't love tariffs, you're somehow a shill of China, or that if you love America, you have to love tariffs. People who don't love tariffs don't love America. You know, part of this is him having fun. Part of this is him asserting his power. I think what I'm just mostly shocked by, as I hinted at before, is that Donald Trump's number one priority in his first term was to oversee a healthy and robust economy. Now, if Donald Trump really believes that this level of tariff on key allies is how you're going to get a robust economy overnight in America, because he really cares about the short term, that is an incredible pivot in his thinking, and he actually has never been very forthcoming about it. And as I said, he's going to have to own it because he did this without his government. He did this completely on his own via executive order. That's how I get my head around perhaps where Donald Trump is or where he's going. But that doesn't mean there aren't going to be consequences to what he's decided to do.
William, I'll let you reply to that. It seems to me, just observing you and Kate talking, that the difference might be on whether the last 30 to 40 years have really been that prosperous, and perhaps we're not just talking about economics here.
Yeah, I mean, my first port of call, really, the first point I make when I debate free trade liberals is to take a look around at what the situation is now, right? So in our own economy, we probably want to talk about that. We've had 30, 40 years of prioritizing services, and particularly London and the Southeast, but the Midlands and the North have deindustrialized, extensively. I mean, 1980, manufacturing is about 32% of the GDP, probably about 9% now. Basically, we've lost it. And a lot of that 9% is food production for the domestic market, so all the necessity is here. So the effects, my point is that the effects of this free trade project, and it is utopian. Historically, I think what Trump and Vance are doing now is actually a return to history. I think you've had an experiment, and it's not really worked. And you only have to look at a lot of what government does in Britain now, as I said before, is mopping up the blood. Many of the cities like Birmingham, Manchester, you've got places like Hartlepool and Blackpool with, 25% of adults on some sort of out of work benefit. And that's the point. I mean, the rhetoric I use, it would be cheaper to keep the factories open. The cost of this economic failure is absolutely stark. So if you want to argue in favor of the status quo, that's what you've got to argue. You've got to argue it's working. And my point, and JD Vance's point, is not working. And people obviously have a right to say, I think we should do a turn in this direction or that direction, try and cure it. I think reindustrialization, reshoring, and less indifference about where stuff is made and who owns what, I think would do us a lot of good.
Well, actually, let's talk about Britain, since you both want to talk about it. Given our current trade position, first to you, William, and then to Kate, given our current trade position with America, would, let's say you're Prime Minister, William, which one day I hope you will be, would the sensible thing to do then to respond to Trump's saying we don't, we might leave the UK alone, to say actually Britain should be slapping more tariffs and protection against the overreaching American economy?
Well, first, on the trade stats, so this is highly contested. Kate said that the Americans have a trade surplus. The ONS seem to think we have, if you go on the website.
Well, that is important to point out. It's a technical paperwork issue that Donald Trump happens to think that the U.S. has the trade surplus. There is a big debate about it, but it makes him happy to see the numbers he sees.
Right.
Yeah, but I think the UK has a trade surplus with the United States, and actually, I've argued the first thing I will do is not sign any free trade agreement. I mean, if it works for us, because I really think it matters, Freddy. I think it matters. It's not just some economists, particularly free market economists, are inclined to look at flow all the time. They're looking at the flow of trade and thinking that's good. But you've got to look at the stock. What do you end up after you've done the trade? And I'll give you an instance of this. Was Liz Truss's, Japanese free trade agreement, which she was bragging about. But if you looked at it, her own department modeled it and said that we've got a bilateral trade deficit with Japan now. And Liz Truss's agreement is going to make it worse. It's projected to increase Japanese exports to us by 80% and our exports to Japan about 30%. So it's going to get worse. And I would argue you're going to end up poorer as a result. It's not a sensible thing to do. So the first thing I would do on the USA is leave it alone. There's not a lot you can do if Trump applies tariffs. I don't know whether he would. But look at how incompetent the UK government has been on the basics. Perfect example. The biggest single, by category, the biggest single export of the United States to the UK is crude oil. But this government is refusing to open up the Rosebank oil fields near Shetland. That is crazy. What are they doing? About half of the UK's trade deficits are accounted by with energy imports. And that's a mess that our own government has got into, Tory and Labour, by just being indifferent to where stuff's made. You've got to get with it and start producing energy here.
Well, Kate, what do you think about that? I mean, it certainly seems true. If we are at a turning point in history, our government seems to be singing from the old hymn sheet.
I think I found an area of overlap of agreement between William and me, and it is on this point about what governments can do to roll back their own regulations, their own glass ceilings, their own caps on their ability to be prosperous and to move forward almost regardless of how other nations decide to act, because in many ways that is out of your control. I mean, if I were the Labour government, I would be trying to be as quiet as possible for as long as possible, so nobody really noticed that no one has slapped tariffs on me, and also so my European friends and allies who I was trying to do more trade with didn't get very angry or jealous that I was exempt from tariffs that they almost certainly are going to have to experience. How long the Labour government can do that, I don't know, but I would certainly try to be friendly to both sides. William and I very much disagree about past 30 or 40 years. I think that broadly speaking, the huge expanse of trade and what many call globalization now has made us all more prosperous, certainly for those at the bottom, but also for those at the top. And it's given us so much more choice. It's given us more personal autonomy. I think across the board, this has been a very good news story, but I would never advocate for the status quo. I think that so much of what's holding us back, I think those areas you talked about, Birmingham, outside of Manchester, just, basically move outside the southeast. I think it is the government that time and time again has been failing those communities to not give them the opportunities to build anything new. They are the ones stuck in the past. They are the ones who have not been able, the government, the politicians, they are the ones who have not been able to look at the regulations and what is keeping this cap on the UK and say, how do we get new industry? How do we create better jobs? The fact that it takes 12 to 15 years to build any energy infrastructure in this country, the fact that it is impossible to build more homes, the fact that you are subject to the same kind of corporation tax in Birmingham as you are in London, or in Manchester as you are in London. I mean, that is outrageous. There should be far more competition, even within the UK, to get industry more attracted to other parts of the UK and to actually give them reason to go there. I don't think it's America's fault. I don't think that it's India's fault or China's fault, frankly, that Birmingham is in the state that it's in. I think that it's absolutely crucial for UK politicians to take account of their responsibility in that. And that is why, and it's a good time to talk about it, one of the merits of Brexit is that you can't outsource these problems anymore. You can't point your finger at the EU. You can't point your finger anywhere else. You have to take accountability for what's gone wrong in your own country. I personally don't think that it's far too simplistic to say it's free trade. The issue is where the government has come in and actually said, no, we're going to stop you from taking advantage of all that the world has to offer to bring it here and to build anything new.
William, I'll let you reply to that, but particularly let's focus on that Brexit point, because it seems to me the very fact that Trump might be ruling Britain out of these tariffs suggests a Brexit benefit that possibly isn't being discussed in most parts of the media.
Yeah, he may. I mean, I think it's interesting how sentiment, Trump's own view today, seems to be influencing his policies here. So I don't think they're entirely sort of evidence-based. And I think if we're lucky, Britain may just escape it. I've said before, I think some of the things that members of our government have said about Trump is not helpful. You have a foreign secretary that compared Trump to a neo-Nazi. I think it's very foolish. I think it's foolish of Starmer to appoint him as foreign secretary, given that he said that. So we may be lucky. We may well be lucky. But no, I'll agree with Kate on this point. I think the misgovernance, I think it's the whole package that counts. I think the broad trade rules that your economy has to abide by do set the tone for what is going to happen. And they're extremely powerful. Give an example, the single market, the EU single market. Go on to trading economics, have a look at the size of the UK's trade deficit, look at it before and after the single market. The single market is basically a boxing ring. If you're not a heavyweight, if you haven't got cheap power and you're not at the center of it, if you're not Germany, basically, you did denaturalize. That's just what happened. It happened to Portugal, Italy, Greece, and it happened to us if you're on the edge. So I think that the macro trade rules are important. But I totally agree with Kate that just government incompetence and ineptitude has really contributed to it. We preside over a housing market, which is our macroeconomic, from a domestic point of view, our biggest problem. That's just sheer incompetence. The planning system is blocked, and state sector capacity in house building has been deliberately destroyed. So no matter where you look at energy. The Tories deliberately closed down British nuclear fuels. This was an industry that Britain pioneered and led in the 50s and 60s. Blair let it go, preferred to engage in expensive foreign wars or do anything sensible like look at energy resilience. And you are where you are. So I think the Labour and Tory parties really are a lot to blame for this. I'm not denying that. Absolutely right.
Finally, Kate and William, I'm going to ask you to do a boring prediction.
Oh, no.
Will Trump's tariff put the US into recession over the next year?
My prediction, which I'd just like to say to viewers, is probably wrong. I'm not confident here. Is that it probably won't come to that. I wonder if these tariffs are long for this world, and if if perhaps a 25% tariff on Canadian goods is not going to last long. Let's not forget that in his first term, the US and Canada played the trade war game and then quietly dropped it about a year later. I would not be surprised if so-called concessions were made and they managed to get around this.
William, your turn to make the prediction. Will the US be in a recession in a year's time as a result of Trump's tariffs?
No, highly unlikely for many reasons. But the biggest one is that it's only part of the economy. Most of the economy of services will be largely unaffected. And as I say, 7%, if it stays anything like this, is likely to have a huge effect on inflation. The budget deficit is still quite large, and that'll keep it going. So I don't predict a recession. And remember, one final thing. Tariffs are a bit like trade sanctions. Actually, technically, they are expansionary for the domestic economy that is experiencing them. So you will get an effect that'll start as a result of the tariffs domestically in the United States. So no recession.
Next, Angus Colwell sat down with philosopher Agnes Callard to discuss her unconventional life as a philosopher.
Your book is called the Case for the Philosophical Life. So, sort of, could you make the case for the philosophical life, sort of briefly?
Yeah. Maybe the first premise is something like, anything that you ever do, you're going to do it better if you understand what it is that you're doing. But a key component to what it is that you're doing is why it is that you're doing it. And we have a lot of reasons for things that we're doing that are kind of sitting there almost in the back of our minds or in the corner of our eye, and we don't quite know why we're pursuing many of the things we pursue. To live a philosophical life is to keep those why questions open, to keep our attitudes to what we're doing inquisitive, where that primarily is a function of how we interact with other people on the occasions that we have to inquire into those questions.
So would you say you're quite mistrustful of the idea that's been expressed by Burke and several others that there is wisdom in the sort of habits that have passed down from generation to generation? We shouldn't question them too much because they've evolved for a reason, you know?
I think the claim that there's wisdom in them and the claim that we shouldn't question them sort of contradict each other. That is, if there's wisdom in something, then the wisdom is something you can learn. But in general, we learn by questioning. Like if you were trying to learn some physics or some math, what you would do is like play with the equations. You would ask questions. That's how learning works.
Onto sort of playing and questioning. Let's sort of start with Socrates, who this book is sort of pegged to and is very much about. Viewers will know that Socrates is sort of the father of Western philosophy, or is considered the father. Can you talk for a little bit about how do we know about him, and from what we can gain from that, what kind of man was he?
Yeah, so he lived in the 5th century BC in Athens, and he, we know some biographical details. His father was a stonecutter, his mother was a midwife. The way we know about him is primarily from 3 sources. Aristophanes, who's a comic playwright who wrote a play sort of mocking Socrates. And then slightly later, Plato and Xenophon, who wrote dialogues, which were sort of like plays, but often written in the third person, of Socrates talking to some other guy or some people. We also know that there were many, many other Socratic dialogues. That is, after Socrates died, this thing where you'd write a text of Socrates talking to some other person became a genre. This genre got created sort of spontaneously in response to the persona of Socrates, which tells you something about who he was. He was a shock to the system. He was the kind of guy you can't forget. And the way that people tried to not forget him was to sort of reenact the way he lived his life. He himself did not write anything down. He didn't write down his ideas or his arguments or whatever. So he's preserved through the writings of other people, but he's preserved really well. If you just like compare him to other figures in the ancient world, our record on Socrates is excellent.
There are 2 schools of thought on what we can know about Socrates, particularly through Plato. A lot of people think that Plato is sort of extrapolating himself and channeling himself into Socrates. Others think that Plato genuinely sort of loved Socrates and was trying to preserve his wisdom for others. Where do you stand on that?
I think they're both true of different periods in Plato's life. So, and here I'm just giving you the standard scholarly consensus, which is that early Plato, which is the dialogues that my book focuses on relatively earlier in his life, in dialogues like the Lakes, the Charmides, the Meno, but also sort of more middle dialogues like the Phaedo, the Symposium, etc. Plato is in large part trying to present us with somebody that he encountered who he thought was extraordinary, a world historical individual who developed like a new mode of being. But I do think that later, and I put the division roughly where the standard, it sounds weird, but it's in the middle of, after the first book of the Republic, basically, is you start to get sort of more Plato's voice than Socrates. Even there, Plato's voice is put into a Socrates who behaves recognizably like Socrates, and there are certain moments, even in the quite late dialogues, like the Theaetetus and the Philebus, where I feel like Socrates shines through. But I just think Plato did both of those things.
Okay, can we talk about the Socratic dialogue as a sort of mode of philosophy? How is it done?
Yeah, so it works roughly like this. Socrates walks up to someone, or in general, they've already been introduced, that is not a stranger, but he's in some kind of encounter with that person. And Plato will usually do some work to sort of set it up. Like, how did this encounter happen? There might even be a frame, like one guy's telling another guy, remember that time when Socrates was talking to that other guy? Okay, so there's going to be a frame, and there's going to be a little bit of sort of small talk. And then Socrates will find his way to what you might think of as like the sore point of that person's identity. So if that person is a general, he might end up asking them, what is courage? If they're a child, like Lysis, he might ask them, do your parents really love you? If they are like Alcibiades, a guy who wants to rule the world, Socrates might ask, what do rulers do? What do they pursue? If it's an orator, he might say, what is oratory? Are you able to say it? Like, do you have the words? Are you able to speak so as to tell me what oratory is? Gorgias. So what he's doing is he's asking people not just any old question, but in some way a question where they are committed to having deep knowledge about the answer to that question. And then they pursue that answer. Usually what happens is that there's a few sort of unsatisfactory initial responses. Quite often the very first response will be something like, well, that's easy, Socrates. That's obvious. Anyone could give you an answer. There's no problem answering that question. Sometimes like all those in a row with one response in the Meno, we get something like that. And then gradually what Socrates will do is kind of make clear to them what it is that he wants by way of an answer, which is not the thing that they initially thought he wanted. So often, like, let's say to Euthyphro, what is piety? Euthyphro will be like, Euthyphro is like a prophet. Piety is what I'm doing now, persecuting my father. It's a weird story. Maybe we'll get into it. And Socrates is like, no, I didn't want an example. I wanted to know, what is it? What is the thing? Not what's the definition of the word piety. What is the thing, the name of which is piety? Okay. And then they kind of try to work towards an account, and they come up against various stumbling blocks. And as they come up against those stumbling blocks, you start to get into view the very possibility of looking for this thing that Socrates is looking for.
So this is a social philosophy as well. This is a social way of doing philosophy, or sociable.
Yeah, it's a social activity. Language is a social activity, right? I mean, first and foremost, we use language to communicate, and first and foremost, we use it to communicate in person with each other. And philosophy is a form of communication. So it shows up, in this communicative context. My book really pushes that angle. So what I argue is that all of those things are not accidental to the philosophical nature of the topic. That Socrates discovered a really deep fact about certain forms of inquiry, certain kinds of questions that we want answers to. We can't look for those answers by ourselves. We actually need the help of the other person. And so I'm explaining a lot of what shows up in the dialogues by way of sort of Socratic humility and Socratic deference as Socrates pointing us to the fact that he's a needy man. He is reliant on, dependent on, in the hands of people who are willing to answer his questions.
So the image that people might have when they hear you arguing for living a philosophical life is emphatically not the kind that we might associate at first, which is the solitary philosopher in their bedroom with their head in their hands. Right,
exactly. So, you might think the counterpart, in a way, to my book is Descartes' Meditations. Right? Descartes' like, let me lock myself away in a room by myself and ponder. Except he's writing a text to another audience, and it is incredibly engaged and engaging with the audience that he's writing to. But basically, we do have I think Descartes is one of the places. we have this image of the solitary philosopher, I think Socrates kind of shows us that there's a problem with that, at least as far as a subset of the questions that you might want to inquire into are concerned. Namely, we have certain blind spots, and we're not going to see our blind spots. That is, when we sit by ourselves in a room, what we're going to do is affirm what we already think. The worst echo chamber in the world is your own mind. And so what another person is an escape valve from being trapped in your mind.
Peter Singer, who's quite sort of unfashionable now, he once said that ethics is practical, or it is not ethics. What are some of the practical uses of the Socratic dialogue, do you think?
Of the Socratic dialogue. So, I mean, in the last part of my book, I try to bring out the practical implications of Socratic intellectualism, which is sort of the view that you should live your life by way of dialogue. But maybe one way to think about the practical uses of the Socratic dialogue is to think, in many conversations that you're in, maybe even most, there's a kind of space in those conversations that you're not exploring, that you're sort of leaving a way the conversation could open up. You're leaving that space to the side. And that's sort of the space of asking why at the right moment. And you could sort of do that a little bit more in almost any interaction. You have to do it at the right time in the right way. And, sometimes it's not going to work out. As we see, it didn't always exactly work out for Socrates. But it's basically, the practical upshot is that actually the stuff we're already doing in our lives lends itself naturally to philosophy. And what the last part of the book is trying to show you is concretely exactly where, but I actually think it just generically applies, even in areas I don't talk about, like conversations with your kids or with your best friend.
In Britain, we have sort of a long tradition of emotional suppression and the sort of suspicion of philosophy that goes all the way back to when Samuel Johnson kicked the stone to refute, Berkeley's argument about the existence of the external world. Is it a failing if people are not living philosophically? Is that kind of attitude a failing?
Well, first of all, I would really separate emotional suppression and the resistance to philosophy. They're like, philosophy requires a little bit of emotional suppression. That is, often, in order to engage on a topic, and in particular, in order to engage with someone who's saying that you're wrong, you have to tell yourself to chill and to not get defensive and not have the emotional reactions. Actually, before this interview started, as it was starting, I could feel certain emotions coming up in me. I'm ready to be a bit defensive, and I had to tell myself chill. That's not going to help you. It's not going to help you think about answers to questions, right? So I actually think a certain amount of emotional suppression is part of philosophy. Okay, so let's go to the second part. A tradition of, is it bad if people are unphilosophical? I think many people think that about themselves. And in a way, I'm speaking to that in the person. That is, I think that a lot of people, in the corner of their eye, they see this thing that they're not doing that they kind of feel they should be doing. They can't put a name to it, but and that's why I start the book with Tolstoy. So, Tolstoy, in some ways, the most successful human being who ever lived. He'd be on the list, right? In kind of every respect. I mean, not just an incredible novelist, but a role model for all Russians. He made alphabet books for children. He had this big household, lots of kids. He was a nobleman, but he was also cared about the fate of the peasantry. He was a cult leader. I mean, everything, right? He was just amazing from a really young age. And, after he'd written War and Peace and Anna Karenina, but don't worry, he's still going to write amazing stuff later, right? He's 50. He has this crisis where he's my life has no meaning. There's no point to anything. And nothing I've done has any value. And you're just wait, Tolstoy can say that? He can worry about whether his life has any value. If he can worry about it, all of us have to worry about it, right? And what he says is that he realized that there were these questions he was holding at bay all along. That there was this existential crisis sort of looming for him that hit him at a certain point. And I think a lot of people either hit that crisis or they feel like it's waiting in the wings for them. And maybe the richer we get, the more luxurious our lives get, the more free time we have, the greater the chances that we're not going to be able to hold that crisis at bay with the thought, no, there's something I must urgently do now.
And would you say that had he, there's a quote from him here that I've got where he said, if an enchantress had come and offered to fulfill my desires for me, I wouldn't have known what to say, which you quote in your book. Would you say that had he really thought about it or really discussed it, sort of almost Socratically, he would have known what to say?
Absolutely.
Do you think there is an answer out there? There was a belief system that was sort of secretly sustaining him and he was unaware of it?
Oh, no, I think it's that if he had someone to talk about it, he could find the answers.
Okay.
It's like if you ask me, if an enchantress could come to me and tell me and give me my deepest desires, like I've got some things to ask for. And the things I have to ask for are the products of conversations that I've had that have made me like get into view. Like, for instance, what are the things that are blocking me from, living the life I want to live? I have a conception of that. And so I have a thought about what I want to wish for. Look, I could be wrong. But I wouldn't have that if I hadn't been able to think about what it is that I want. And thinking about what I want is a conversational activity.
So you're with Mill had a sort of famous quote about better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. You would agree with that?
What's funny about that quote? I mean, it's of course Mill saying that is Mill challenging his own view, right? So Mill's a utilitarian, and Mill has this theory where it's like, well, the point of life is utility, where the most natural way to catch that out is happiness. But he's just also a highly cultured man, and so it's a very Socratic moment in Mill, right? Because Mill is like, yes, of course we're going for pleasure, but I'm going to have to make this distinction between higher and lower pleasures that I can't justify in terms of the foundational principle of my theory, but I'm just going to do it because it seems true, because I'm going to be true to this insight and potentially sort of contradict my own basic principle and acknowledge that it's better to be Socrates. It's better to be dissatisfied and be unhappy, have less utility. I think Socrates was happy, though. That is, Socrates was dissatisfied and he was happy. I think that there's such a thing as the best life. The best life is the life that you have if you have knowledge, and then you know what you're doing, and then you always do the right thing. Socrates did not live that life because he didn't have knowledge, but he lived the second best life. The second best life is the life lived towards knowledge or in the pursuit of knowledge if you don't have it. And the reason why I think Socrates has an explanation for why you'd rather be Socrates than the pig, or certainly than the human being who doesn't who assumes that he knows a bunch of stuff that he doesn't know, is that none of us wants the appearance of the good. We want the real good. Of course, whatever appears to us to be good, we think is the real good, and so we go after it. But our commitment is to going after the real good. And Socrates, because he takes an inquisitive attitude, because he doesn't assume that he knows what he doesn't know, he's able to live his life in pursuit of the real good.
Well, he as you write, he believed that ignorance was the sort of stem of all problems. Is his aim truth or knowledge? I was sort of reading your book and trying to separate in my mind what was different between those two things. Are people, when they philosophize, should they be aiming for truths? Do you think, truths that are out there that they can attain through discussion and query and reasoning? Or what's the difference between truth and knowledge?
There's a really important difference. So this comes to the fore towards the end of the dialogue, the Meno, where Socrates says, is true opinion just as good a guide as knowledge, right? So, and he says, look, let's say you knew the road to Larissa, right? Then you could go to Larissa. But I mean, if you just had a true opinion about the road to Larissa and you didn't have knowledge about it, but you just had a truth, you could also get to Larissa. And Meno's like, oh yeah, I guess so. And Socrates says, so is true opinion the same as knowledge? Are they just as good? And Meno's like, well, true opinion might go away. It might not be stable. Or it might, you might like have it for one moment. And Socrates says, but as long as it sticks around, is it as good? And Meno's like, yeah, I guess so. And Socrates is like, no, wrong answer. Socrates says, it's like the statues of Daedalus. So Daedalus was this mythical sculptor who made these statues that could move. And it would be amazing to own a statue of Daedalus. But imagine you had a statue of Daedalus on your lawn. You might be like, hey, I have a statue of Daedalus. And someone would be like, well, you don't really have it. It could just walk away at any moment. And he's like, what would be good? You have one and it's tied down, so it can't go away. Now you got a statue of Daedalus. He says, knowledge is like that. So the issue about opinion or truth is that it's something that's like in your mind, but not of it. It's sort of sitting there. You sort of absorbed it. But without knowing the reason why, it's not really your own. And a way to think about that is like actually the word for opinion in Greek is doxa. And in Greek, it's the same word as the word for reputation, which when I first encountered it, I thought was super weird. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess they use this word to mean two different things, opinion, reputation. And then eventually, like through reading Greek, I was like, but they don't use it in two different ways. Like it doesn't seem like two different words in the way that they use it. It's that my reputation is your opinion of me, right? A reputation is an opinion. It's somebody else's opinion. And there's a way in which my reputation kind of lives or is housed in you. And so like that sort of bespeaks or makes reference to a kind of social world where people think what they think, partly because they want other people to think well of them, partly because other people think those things. And their attachment to those claims is it's going to move around with the shifting opinions of other people. My reputation moves around with what other people think about me. It's not really mine. And part of what Socrates is doing in introducing the space of knowledge and telling you that you should go for knowledge is to say there's something that could be really yours, and it would be different from an opinion. It wouldn't be contingent on other people in the same way. If you had knowledge, it's like for the first time you would really have a thought.
I'm right to say that part of the appeal of that is stability. I mean, you mention in the book the implications that thinking Socratically might have for politics. Mm-hmm. You see it as a good thing if we're changing our mind a little bit less. Am I right in saying?
Correct.
Yeah.
So I think that along with Socrates that everyone wavers pretty much constantly and cannot say the same thing about the same thing. And we have a kind of illusion of that in politics people are stubborn or they won't change their minds, but really the problem is the opposite. The reason what generates that illusion is that when we change our minds, which we do constantly on every topic, we change the words that we use, and so we make it look consistent superficially. So, like an example that I give in the book with words is just like being cooperative and being conformist. So both of those mean doing what works for other people. But when you do what works for other people and we like it, we call you cooperative. And when you do what works for other people and we don't like it, we call you conformist. And we don't have any kind of systematic account of when should you do what works for other people. That's what we really need. If we had that, we could have a stable thought.
Okay. You also speak on the final part of the book sort of covers politics, and it covers love, and it covers death.
Mm-hmm.
Let's speak about love a little bit. And you write about marriage, which I found very interesting. You questioned whether the status quo that we have with marriages as they evolve at the moment is all that good for us. I mean, if I could quote you, you say you describe a lot of marriages. The company of the person one once chased with breathless abandon loses its thrill. The frequency of both sex and intense conversation decreases. And living together becomes a matter of routine. Even the good case is far from the ideal. Can you speak about that a bit more? It's
Absolutely.
fascinating.
So I think that what I'm doing in that part of the book is adverting to a romantic ideal that we have. And this romantic ideal shows up paradigmatically in movies, in poems, very much so in poems, from the ancient world up till today, and in novels. There's this idea of like passionate romance, and that is an expression of something fundamental about human beings and our like what we need out of life. And I think it's a relatively commonplace thing to say that once you've been married for a long time, there isn't as much passionate romance as there once was. Perhaps this is not true of all marriages, but it's certainly true of many marriages, like if I just trust popular culture's representation of marriage. I think it's why a lot of people fear marriage, actually. So like what I'm doing is showing you that the romantic ideal doesn't fully get itself realized or expressed in marriage. I also think it fails to get itself realized or expressed in single life, dating, even passionate romance, insofar as that tends to lead to, well, horrible breakups, toxic relationships, or dull marriages. It's not, what I'm doing there is not just a critique of marriage. Marriage falls under a larger set of romantic activities where what they point to is it looks like we have an ideal that doesn't get realized. And that's really interesting. Where did we get this ideal? Why do we have it? Why are we sort of applying it to our lives in this way where it makes our lives sort of fall short? If I could give one other example that I think is sort of helpful to see the kind of point that I'm making about the distance between the ideal and the reality, it's an example I give in the book where there are ways that we behave in relation to romance, where if we behaved that way in relation to food, people would think we were insane, like actually insane, had lost our minds. And so like an example I give is you see someone, he's banging on the door of a restaurant and you say, well, this restaurant's closed. And he's like, I have to get in. And you're like, well, what about all the other restaurants on the street? He's like, no, I can't go to this. I can only go to this one. And you say, is the food here really so amazing? He's like, no, it's terrible. I hate the food. So at some point in that conversation, as it progresses, you'd be like, I think you need help. Something is wrong with you. But like, that's a conversation that many of us have had with our friends who are like texting late at night, their ex, who they said was horrible and it was a terrible relationship, and yet they're still obsessed with them. But like, there's other fish in the sea and they could move on. And what is happening there? What is happening with us having normalized that kind of romantic trauma? It suggests that there's an idea or a norm that we have to apply to romance that we just don't apply to food. And that ideal is what I'm interested in.
Socrates argued that the highest kind of love is not for people but for ideals.
Yes.
There's undoubtedly you've thought a lot about that sort of idea. I was wondering if you could talk sort of a bit more about it.
Yes. So Socrates thinks that the right way to think about love of another human being is that what you really love is the ideal, and the human being is kind of like a vehicle to the pursuit of that ideal. So he's not like changing the topic. He's not like saying, well, ignore people, love ideals, because you can only love ideals with people, because the way that you love an ideal is try to pursue it, and the way you pursue it is through conversation with another person. But what he wants to say is that, like, fundamentally, like, what love is in some way connecting to another person. But what is the nature of that connection? What can you get from another person? What is another person to you, right? What use can they be to you, or what way can they connect to you? And Socrates thinks, well, the deepest and most profound connection that you can have to another person is that they can be a source of answers for you, answers to your questions, or a source of questions that will challenge things that you've said. That's in some way what another person is for, as far as you're concerned. And so he thinks the highest ideal of love is an ideal in which you engage in that activity with a view to a certain kind of perfection. Where the important contrast here is that he thinks a lot of people, including people he's interacting with, including people who are falling in love with him, like Alcibiades, are thinking that when you fall in love with someone, you pursue them as perfection. The other human being has to be perfect, ideal, perfectly beautiful, at a perfect age of life, which is, young. And you sort of worship them. And I think Socrates thinks, no, you shouldn't worship other people. And Alcibiades shouldn't worship him. Rather, if you're going to worship something, that thing had better be really, really good. It had better be kind of perfect, an ideal. And what another human being is to help you, in some sense, worship that ideal.
Usually it would be sort of impolite to ask a guest about their personal life, but I hope you don't mind as a sort of example of living a philosophical life and sort of learning how others live. For viewers who might not know, there was a sort of big New Yorker profile about 2 years ago, which described your philosophy of marriage, where you live with your current husband and your ex-husband.
Correct.
Do you still live with both of them?
Yes.
And did your life change much after that piece was published?
No, not that much. There was like a big storm happening in the world, but it didn't hit me that much. Though it may be that my life changed in ways I didn't notice as much, I guess. Like some people maybe liked me less, and so I don't know. Maybe there are things I didn't get invited to, or something that I would have been, but I wouldn't know, right? So there's ways stuff can change that you don't know. I think a lot more people have heard of me because of that piece. So that's like, but that also doesn't change. That's not my life. So that's doxa, right? My reputation is something that exists in the minds of other people. It's not me. I guess one way it changes, people ask me about it a lot.
Yeah.
But there was like a kind of short-term turmoil. I mean, the events that are described are things that happened to me a long time ago. So it wasn't like a recent thing in my life. It was my romantic life didn't change around the time of the.
How long have you been married to your current husband?
We've been married for 12 years, and I think we've all lived. Arnold's my husband. Arnold and I have lived with Ben since my third child, which is Arnold's son, was born. So a big, I think I say this in the piece, I can't remember. A big part of what motivated us to want to live together is that I figured I was going to only have maybe one other kid. I was getting older. That is, I had 2 kids with Ben. I was probably going to only have one other kid. And I really wanted him to have brothers in a really substantive sense, in kind of the sense where I think it really helps if, you're in the same room. I'm a kind of kids in the same room person, family in close space, forced to interact kind of person. And so, I mean, background is we all got along well. I wouldn't have thought of this if we hadn't got along very well. But yeah, so anyway, that's how I remember when it's from. It's basically when Izzy was born. He's 11 now. So we've lived together for maybe 11 years, and then Arnold and I have been married for around 12, something like that. And
do you view your sort of current philosophy, the way that you live, as a result of philosophy? Is this sort of a sort of real world, not that your academic discipline, you're an academic philosopher, should ever be separated from the way you live your life, but many sort of do think and act like that. Do you view this as sort of part life, part philosophy?
I think certain aspects of it are very philosophical, not all of it. So one thing that interesting that happened after the profile actually is lots of people wrote to me and were like, "Oh my God, me too," but I never tell anyone. Or people think I'm so weird, and they're not all philosophers. So this is not an arrangement that only philosophers get into. It's just people are freaked by it. So they're not gonna make it that public. I mean, mostly, it's not like I made it public before I was asked about it in an interview either. So why would people know otherwise? But I really think if I want to identify the philosophical parts of it, it's sort of the fact that, when Ben and I were getting divorced, the way we did that is to think it through together, where there's a thing Socrates says that I love, that I talk about in the equality part of the book, calling for a vote from one man alone, where I think we were able to navigate the part of our relationship where we were breaking up through conversation, because our relationship wasn't just a relationship of attachment and marriage in a certain way. It had this other strand to it that was continuous. We had a kind of ability to think things through together, and had thought so many things through together. I mean, had so many conversations that were sort of, some of them were practical about our lives, and some of them were more abstract. We'd had so much practice talking to each other, I guess, about so many different topics, that even when we encountered something where there was no real cultural script for it, we were able to navigate it. That does seem to me to be philosophical, though I could imagine that maybe a couple that was therapists or something, they're we use therapy to, it's possible. I don't want to claim philosophy is the only thing that could do that.
The piece sort of sets it up as a binary choice that you had to make, which I'm not sure if you share yourself, between living honestly and sort of the common desire, why probably a lot of couples where it's not quite working stay together for the kids.
Yes.
That's part of a sort of suite of off-the-shelf recommendations for these types of things that is said to anyone just as a default, you shouldn't be friends with your ex and things like that.
Yes.
Do you think life would sort of be better for a lot of people if more of us questioned those sort of received wisdoms?
I think that the time when a crisis hits is generally not going to be the time when you start questioning. That is, you're going to need to practice before that, is the first thing I would say, is that it would be pretty hard to think creatively about cultural scripts starting at the moment when your partner tells you they fall in love with someone else or something like that. You're going to feel the magnetic pull of a certain set of emotions and a certain set of validated responses that all your friends will tell you, yeah, you should respond in that way if you respond in those ways. to really think it through like on your own in that sense, that is in the sense where you're not ensnared in doxa, in the world of doxa, you will have had to think about it before then. And so the question, should you question it? I think it matters like when. I'm not saying like, oh, well, the minute you decide to get divorced, now's the time to question everything. Like, now's the time when it's the hardest to question everything. Arnold sometimes says, your theory of marriage is a preparation for divorce. And I kind of think that that's right. It's like, look, you might have to get divorced from your spouse. That just, any couple, that is possible for that to happen. It's possible that the world hits you with a kind of thing where after that, you're just like, we can't be together. I think it's possible for anyone. And the question is, how, if that would happen, if that catastrophe would happen, and maybe there are many couples where the kind of catastrophe that would cause that is so extreme that it's really unlikely to happen. Okay, but if it were to happen, how would you deal with it? How would you navigate it? Could you do it with like dignity and decency towards one another in an open-minded and inquisitive and truth-seeking way? Like, marriage is a preparation for that in a way.
Well, I think it's almost now in this country 1 in 2 marriages end in divorce. But you would see that as, but every marriage acts like it'll never happen, you know?
Right, exactly. And like, in a way, divorce is, maybe it's a little bit like those like hidden questions that I was talking about at the beginning, where there's like stuff at the corner of your eye that you don't think about. You certainly don't think about the prospect of divorce when you get married. And I'm not really saying you should always be thinking about the prospect of divorce. What I'm saying is you should think about your relationship as the kind of relationship that would have the strength in a way to withstand the divorce. But what I mean by withstanding the divorce is like being able to converse through it.
Do you think divorce needs sort of be this terrible sort of social failing that you know that needs to be terrible for the children, or do you think that there can be such a thing as sort of a positive right divorce?
I mean, when I was like going to get divorced, and you know, when this prospect was first showing up for me, I thought it was going to be devastating for my children. Like, I thought I was traumatizing my children, and like, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to do it anyway. Like, they're going to be hurt. You know, that's the way life is. I'm going to help them through it. And like, life is hard, and sometimes your hard life starts a little bit early. That was the way I thought about it. That turned out to be wrong. Like, as a matter of fact, my children were not traumatized. They like, well, the third one's glad he exists, and the first two like are very glad to have Arnold, you know, who from their point of view has the role of a father to them, and they think they're lucky to have like an extra parent. Like, it's great right now. I'm away from my kids. One of my kids was sick when I left, you know, having 2 people in the house to take care of them. Like, I think worked out. But I think that, and I know lots of people where they have like custody sharing arrangements and stuff where that are longstanding, where at least from my observation, you know, kids' life is perfect, but the kids seem happy, flourishing, doing well. I think the process of divorce can be incredibly hard on kids. That is that period, especially if it's protracted. Lots of things are hard for kids, though. It's worth keeping in mind, not just divorce. Going to school can be incredibly hard and incredibly traumatic. Like, day after day after day of the kid's life can be kind of hell because they're in school. We put kids in school anyway. You know, loneliness can be really hard for kids who don't have friends. Like, so many things can be hard when you're a kid. There's just lots of trauma that you're going to face when you're a kid. So I guess I tend to think that the process of divorce itself is going to tend to be hard on kids. Whether the result is hard on them is partly a function of how that's managed and arranged, like how many other people are in the kids' lives to help out, and I guess partly a result of how society's organized.
I want to move on to sort of the final part of the interview, which is I wanted to ask you, as a philosopher, some of your thoughts on some of the philosophical trends and discussions that have been going on over the past few months and years. Marriage is an interesting one because we had, just towards the tail end of last year in this country, a very interesting political debate about whether or not cousin marriage should be banned in this country. 90% of people said yes. And then there were a couple of libertarians who said, no, I do not want the state to be deciding who anyone may or may not marry. That's a sort of obviously standard libertarian. I'm not saying all libertarians think that, but there were a couple. I was wondering your thoughts on that discussion.
Yeah, I've never thought about this topic before, but here are my initial thoughts. So I think that, so in the book I talk about that absent philosophy, the guidance that we have as to how to live our lives comes from two sources. The first source is our body and, the feeling of pleasure and pain, first and foremost, our appetitive desires, but then also all the resources that we see fit to gather in order to be able to, in the future, satisfy those desires. So the desire for wealth, etc. That's one source. But I wouldn't put that even at 50%. I would put it maybe at like 20%, 30%. And then the rest, if you don't do philosophy, it's going to be all the rest, right? No. The rest is what I call kinship bonds, which I'm stretching the word kinship because I'm stretching it to include really all group membership. Maybe I should have called it membership bonds. But so like a lot of how we behave, what we're doing is following rules that pertain to the group that we're in. And that's probably like a big part of what Burke was thinking about in his like wisdom. Like the wisdom is like just do what everyone else around you does is generally what like traditional wisdom is. And so dress like the people around you, talk like the people around you, have the right facial expressions in the context that the kind that you're supposed to, in the context that you're in. The way that you do burials, the way that you do weddings, ceremonies, what festivals you celebrate, all those things. You're given directions. You're given like a set of instructions from the group that you belong to. But of course, we all belong to a lot of groups, right? So we might belong to the group of like our family, by which we mean your parents and your siblings. And then there's another family you belong to, which is like your spouse and your children. At least some people have both of those families. And those demands are not always like the same sets of demands. And there's a kind of deep question about the relationship. Actually, a lot of Greek tragedy is sort of about the family that you came from versus the family that you create and the tensions that can exist there. And like, which one do you really belong to? Antigone, for example. Well, I mean, of course, Oedipus, we got to start with Oedipus, right? Who mixes the two families together to this horrifying effect. And Antigone, is your loyalty to your future husband, Haemon, and the children you might have with him, or is your loyalty to your brother, Polynices, and burying him and your parents and that family, right? So this is like a problem for human life, that we belong to many groups and we belong to multiple families. And I think norms about who you can marry are sort of about this territory. They're about kinship bonds and the structure of kinship bonds and separating the family that you came from the family that you create. Creating that separation is like important to us. I'm not exactly sure why. It's actually a pretty deep question. But it's a thing that human beings like noticed, a very long time ago. That is, we've been observing this for a very long time. And so, like, it seems to me that, one thing that we culturally seem to want to do is in some way police the forming of those bonds and maintain the kinship structures that we have in the way that we have them. And there's a question, how do we do it? Libertarians don't want to do it with the law. They probably still don't want you to marry your cousin, and they don't want to marry their cousins, right? But they want to separate the law from the kinship relation, fine. But in a way, the deeper, more interesting questions about the kinship relation itself and like what are the rules that govern it? Like who are you allowed to marry? This is something that people have been trying to police with social norms for a super long time. Like last night I talked about the institution of the charivari, which was like, in a medieval peasant village, if you did something wrong as regards marriage, you married someone too much older than you, someone too much younger than you, someone from a village too far away, someone who's too close, you married someone too close to a time when someone in your family died, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of rules about who you're allowed to marry, when, and how. People would go outside your house and start banging pots and pans to be like, a norm violation has been committed. This was not it sounds funny. It sounds kind of cute. People committed suicide because of these, and not just the shame, the noise. They couldn't sleep. It was a real problem. This was like a major mechanism of social control, right? If you married your cousin and you weren't supposed to in that group, or maybe if you didn't marry your cousin because you were supposed to in that group, you might get a charivari. We're still living in the world of the charivari. Sometimes it takes the form of the Twitter mob or whatever, right? And we're living in that world because we're still policing a set of norms that we haven't fully grasped. And that's my way of thinking about this question.
I mean, yeah, you mentioned the Twitter mob. You're sort of notoriously on Twitter. Have you found, since its founder has proclaimed an increasing support of free speech, do you think that the public square has sort of improved in the past 2 years, or that any of this has been genuine?
So it's an interesting fact, and I sort of like observe this in my book, that like if you say question everything, that's not a question, that's an assertion. To assert that you support free speech is not to support anything, it's just to make an assertion. Right? It's one thing to actually speak freely and actually conduce to free speech, and it's another thing to like have that as your mantra. All I'm saying is there's an in principle separation between those. I'm not making a claim about Eylon in particular. My own experience of Twitter hasn't changed that much since Eylon took over. It hasn't, I don't think it's changed because he took over. I think I have withdrawn from Twitter a bit over the years. That is when I joined it. I joined in 2018, which is kind of late. And I had a lot of optimism about Twitter as a venue for philosophical engagement. And I have less optimism now, though it's probably still more than most people actually, but less than I had. And I've actually recently, coincidentally, to try to understand why my optimism has decreased, I've just been doing a lot of reading on conversation and from a lot of different areas of like psychology, linguistics, philosophy, but then I hit upon the people who really understand conversation, which is sociologists. And what sociologists sort of lay bare is like just how much structure is in the interaction we're having right now. So like you respond to stuff I say in 0.2 of a second, which is faster than your brain can process the signal from the end of when I speak to like respond. So what's happening is you're predicting when I'm going to talk next, and you're accurate. You're able to do it, even though we don't know each other. In fact, you're doing it even faster because we don't know each other. We do this better in a way, not better, but faster when we don't know each other, because awkward pauses are more of a thing with strangers. Because with strangers, you never know, like, does she hate me? Or, you know, it like, is the conversation over? I don't know. So you want to like make sure that you respond quickly. Okay. So that's just the pause thing. There's turn taking. When am I done talking? Right. In a group, I mean, incredibly complicated. There's like the use of we don't tend to repeat nouns too much in conversation. So if I say mill, then the next time I'm going to say he. I'm not going to say mill again. And what that should, like my utterance will quickly become embedded in its context. Okay, so that's how human communication works. That is, we are using a lot of signals and cues, and there's a giant like social structure that our words are embedded in, and that's how we understand each other. And what I've sort of come to realize is like all of that's missing on Twitter, and we don't even realize it's missing. Like because we don't notice it's there most of the time. We don't notice the use that we're making of it. But I think we are, and so I just think on Twitter, we are understanding each other incredibly poorly, and people interpret that as malevolence or bad intention. And it's mostly that like our brains and our social practices are not adapted for communicating in the absence of a set of cues that in fact are absent on Twitter.
And yeah, and one of the other, and this was sort of very big on Twitter back in the day, but since the fall of Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, has sort of had a bit of a public image problem. One of the most notorious examples of philosophy being acted out and done in public over the past few years has been effective altruism, which I'm sure viewers know, but was sort of about giving what you can, doing the most good with what you're giving. And it was sort of a kind of reheated utilitarianism. That movement is widely regarded to have failed. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what went wrong with that whole scene.
I think there are lots of effective altruists still, and they're still doing their thing. I think they were shamed in the public eye, and the way people talk about that is they failed. Whether they're going to achieve something or not remains to be seen. But I guess more generally, I actually think philosophy is getting acted out all the time. Actually, most of our actions are philosophy being acted out. So I think like there are two fundamental ethical systems that are available to people, let's say in the West today. One of them is utilitarianism, and people do think in utilitarian terms and have utilitarian intuitions. And like that's a philosophical theory that people produced, and it's trickled down into our everyday lives. And the second is Kantianism, which says like treat people with respect, do your duty, and don't use another human being as a means. These two sets of intuitions often come into conflict with each other, and then people feel at sea. And so we have these trolley problems that illustrate the fact that our two philosophical theories that ground everything we do in our everyday life aren't fully consistent with one another. We're not always sure which to follow. There's a third theory that, has become popular in philosophy, has touched down less in everyday life yet, which is Aristotelian virtue ethics. And that says, be a certain kind of person, be a generous, decent, just, etc. person. Don't worry so much about whether you're maximizing utility or whether you're doing your duty. Worry about the kind of person you are, being habituated to being that kind of person. Okay, what my book is an attempt to give you an additional item on that menu, is to say there's another ethical theory. It's going to touch down in your life. It's going to change how you do everything. And it says the point of life is not utility or duty or being a certain kind of person. The point of life is to acquire knowledge. And a big part of my book is to say, if you start to live your life this way, it will change how you do everything.
So when you talk about, we are living philosophically in many ways. I mean, there's a very popular saying in this country is every pub is a parliament, by sort of the diverse people it brings in and the issues discussing. So when someone meets up with their friend and so they've been through a breakup or say they're having a crisis about, what job they should take next and they discuss it, they are philosophizing? Or
So I don't think I said we're living philosophically. I said we're acting out philosophy.
Sorry, yes, yeah.
What I meant was we take a certain set of philosophical thoughts and we stop thinking about them and we just act them out. And I do think that if you act out Socratic intellectualism, you're living philosophically. But I don't think that's true of the other theories. And I don't think the proponents of those theories would disagree with me about that. That is, most Kantians don't think you have to be a philosophical intellectual to be a good person. That is what Socratic intellectualism says. But then if you ask me, okay, but what happens in the pub? Yeah, I think that that's right. But I also think the thing I said earlier is right, which is that those conversations that happen in the pub when you're asking someone about their breakup, one thing you can do with that conversation is go through a bunch of cultural scripts. Oh, she fell in love with someone else. What a bitch. That conversation is going to work, right? You're going to be playing out a conversation you heard somewhere else, and it's going to go easy and it's going to go smooth. But another thing that you can sort of acknowledge and recognize and see is that there's space in that conversation. There's creative space, individual space, kind of freedom that you have. It may be the most fundamental freedom that we have is conversational freedom, the freedom to take the conversation to a new place and come to think a thought that we hadn't thought before. And yeah, I think that freedom is there for us in the pub.
Well, you make the whole endeavour sound quite fun as well. Agnes Callard, thank you very much.
Trump has been causing a stir in the Middle East and his plans have sparked global condemnation. Eylon Levy joins Freddy Gray to discuss his plans.
Eylon, first of all, I think I just need to start by asking you, what did you make of it all?
Extraordinary indeed. There is astonishment in Israel, people trying to work out whether President Trump was being serious, whether this is a hot air balloon to prepare for a negotiation. But I think the president puts his finger on a very real problem. It is impossible to rebuild Gaza as long as its government, Hamas, says that Israel must be destroyed. It is impossible for Gaza to be rebuilt peacefully as long as its government says that it will continue to wage war against Israel again and again until Israel is destroyed. And it's impossible for Gaza to be rebuilt permanently while the world continues to tell the people of Gaza that they are refugees and they are only there temporarily. Gaza is rubble now. And Gaza is rubble because its government, Gaza, decided to declare war on October 7th. And it decided to wage that war from inside and under civilian buildings. And there is a major question now of how we rebuild Gaza. And I think what's most interesting is not the logistical question of how on earth do you clear that much rubble and rebuild those buildings when you have civilians in such a small area, but how do you rebuild permanently and peacefully without setting the stage for the next war? And as long as Gaza remains under the control of Hamas and remains under the control of Hamas's jihadi ideology, it's impossible for Gaza to be rebuilt peacefully, and that's what we need.
Well, it also might be impossible to resettle the Palestinian people. I mean, it does seem like pie-in-the-sky thinking to me.
Well, both UNRWA and President Trump think that the Palestinians should be relocated. Trump thinks they should be relocated to Egypt and Jordan, and UNRWA thinks that the Palestinians should be relocated to Israel. That is why, nearly 80 years after the war of 1948, there are 1.6 million people in Gaza who are officially classified as refugees, even though almost all of them were born inside Gaza, because they believe that Gaza is not their home and they have a right to relocate into Israel. And one of the most welcome things of the last 24 hours has been to hear people in Gaza saying, Gaza is our home. We belong in Gaza. Gaza belongs to us. And I agree with them. They are not refugees. And the focus after this war should be on rebuilding permanently and peacefully so that they can build better lives inside Gaza instead of the world fueling those fantasies that one day they will relocate into Israel and live there instead.
American foreign policy under Donald Trump is meant to be about putting America first, America's interests first. And I can see that America benefits from having an ally in the region. But the sheer cost, and also perhaps the military investment of troops and possible lives lost to actually achieve this dream state in Gaza, is extraordinary, is it not? I mean, it's not necessarily something that Trump's voters would have been thinking about when they cast their ballots for him.
And I have no idea what President Trump is planning, whether he is envisaging some sort of American military intervention or facilitating somehow the voluntary departure of people while Israel finishes the job against Hamas. But he puts his finger on a very real problem, which is that as long as Hamas remains in power in Gaza, we are doomed to the same cycle of violence. Hamas, the government of Gaza, decided on October 7th to launch war. It decided to launch war with barbaric atrocities that shocked the world, the families burned alive, the beheadings, the torture, the mutilations. And Hamas is telling us that it is going to do that again and again. Hamas is threatening to do it on multiple borders from Israel. And that is why Israel is determined that Hamas has to go. It has to be defeated in order to give a chance of a better future for people inside the region. And what we need to hear coming from inside Palestinian society now is that what they want is to rebuild permanently and peacefully, and that they want to embrace the vision of rebuilding Gaza as an amazing place. Gaza has so much potential. On that, President Trump is right. You know, Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. It pulled out its army. It's pulled out 9,000 Israelis, 9,000 settlers, and there was genuine hope that the Palestinians were going to be given a chance to create their own mini-state there and show what peace would look like. But it was taken over by Hamas, a jihadi regime that used it to declare war on Israel. And we need to see permanent, peaceful reconstruction inside Gaza, with people committed to building real, permanent, peaceful lives inside, instead of being committed to waging this forever war against Israel until it's destroyed. And that is what we are going to be doomed to, that eternal cycle of violence, if this war ends with hostages still in Gaza or Hamas still in power.
But isn't the most likely solution that Israel, not the US, will take control, will be in charge of Gaza in the future then?
Well, Israel isn't asking for America to intervene militarily. Israel has never asked for America to intervene militarily. Israel says what we want from America as our ally is to receive the weapons that we need and the diplomatic support that we need in order to do the job. Israel has never wanted to get American troops involved. And throughout this war, Israel has been saying, we are going to bring down Hamas so it can never do this again, and to bring back the hostages. But the question is, what happens after you clear Hamas? How do you get to the day after? Because Israel says it doesn't want to control Gaza. It doesn't want Hamas to control Gaza. Israel says it wants Gaza to be controlled by local Palestinians who are committed to rebuilding peacefully and living next to Israel, free from Hamas's jihadi ideology. So the question is, how do we get to that day after? There are negotiations now for stage 2 of the ceasefire. Israel says Hamas has to be removed from power. Hamas is saying we're going to remain in power. But it's clear that we're going to be stuck in this cycle of violence as long as Hamas remains in power. And that's why Israel is saying, look, give us the tools that we need to finish the job against Hamas. And then it will be possible to move to a day after in which Gaza is no longer under this jihadi ideology that is committed to a forever war against the existence of Israel.
There's a fair bit of speculation, Eylon, that Trump's real agenda here is not actually this sort of fantastical project in Gaza that he was talking about yesterday. And it's more about leverage over the Arab states, and in particular Saudi Arabia. Do you think that's what's going on here? Trump is putting it on the plate of Israel's neighbours to say they need to step up and help the Palestinians if they want to have some say in the future.
I think that's a very sensible interpretation, that what President Trump is trying to do is push the Arab states to play a more active role in the day after planning. And the day after means the day after Hamas. Israel has been clear this war cannot end with the jihadi regime that started this war still in power. Israel wants to see local Palestinian actors who aren't committed to Hamas's jihadi ideology take power in Gaza and to be supported by the local Arab states. What's the problem? Israel has been left alone in thinking about what to do the day after because no one wants to touch the Gaza Strip with a barge pole. All the Arab countries understand that it is an enormous headache, that in order to have any chance of peace, you need to destroy Hamas, demilitarize Gaza, and de-radicalize Palestinian society. And of course, none of them want to touch this immense challenge. And so it is a very sensible interpretation to say what President Trump is trying to do is to tell the Arab states, you need to roll up your sleeves and play a role in the peaceful reconstruction of Gaza and the removal of Hamas from power. But then again, when it comes to President Trump's plans to take over Greenland and Panama and other ideas around the world, no one knows what is serious at the moment and what is just a hot air balloon to try to gauge reactions.
What would a de-radicalization program look like? Because a lot of people would regard that as slightly frightening sounding.
Well, de-radicalization in Gaza means what denazification meant in Germany after the Second World War. This war needs to end with the people of Gaza blaming their regime for bringing this disaster on them. If the Second World War had ended with the immense destruction that the Allies wrought on Germany, with Germans nursing their wounds, praising the Nazis, blaming the Allies for their destruction, World War III would have come just a few years later. Instead, there was a re-education program, and Germany was encouraged to rebuild and move away from the ideology of the Nazis. There was a Marshall Plan, which came after the defeat of Nazi Germany. And Germany and Japan are now both prosperous democracies and strong Western allies. And the same can happen in Gaza. The Gaza Strip has so much potential. If the people of Gaza and whoever governs Gaza decides they want to live in peace next to Israel, instead of being committed to a forever war, to forever jihad against Israel until it is destroyed, they have to be weaned off not just Hamas's rule, but also its ideology.
Well, that's all interesting, but very contentious stuff. I want to ask you a little bit about Iran, because perhaps really the more pressing and immediate news story was what happened, what the White House declared about Iran after Bibi, Netanyahu and Trump met, which is back to maximum pressure, sanctions, and an absolute commitment to stop Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon, creating a nuclear weapon at all costs. Is that really that was really Netanyahu's agenda from that meeting, and he got what he wanted there?
Well, 2025 is going to be crunch time. Israel has made clear it will not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, and military action is absolutely on the table. The Iranian regime, which leads crowds in chants of death to Israel, cannot be allowed to gain the weapons to bring death to Israel. Obviously, we would prefer negotiations and a diplomatic solution, but if that fails, the worst case scenario is in Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And the prospect of a military operation to take out Iran's nuclear facilities was much scarier when it still had Hamas pointing thousands of rockets at Israel. It was much scarier when Hezbollah had missiles that could bring down towers in Tel Aviv. It was much scarier when Iran still had the Assad regime. But it has lost all of those assets. It's lost its air defenses. And Israel will now be looking at the possibility of taking military action against Iran if diplomacy fails. Now, President Trump didn't give Israel full-throated support and say, yes, I will back military action if diplomacy fails. But he's also made clear Iran cannot gain nuclear weapons, and he definitely cannot allow himself to go down in history as the president on whose watch the Iranian regime acquired weapons of mass destruction.
What's your understanding of the current state of the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump? Because as the ceasefire was being brokered, there were lots of reports, lots of talk about disgruntlement, some expressions of disgruntlement between the Trump circle and Netanyahu and his circle. But yesterday that seemed to be put on the side. But I couldn't help thinking, looking at Netanyahu during the press conference, he was making some slightly strange expressions when Trump was talking.
I don't know whether the Prime Minister was surprised by the President's proposals, whether he knows that this is a bargaining tactic to gain leverage to advance normalization with Saudi Arabia, whether this is a real proposal, but it's certainly a huge shift from the previous administration. The president and President Biden and the prime minister were on very rough terms by the end of that administration. We remember, of course, America freezing certain weapons shipments to Israel. And here we have a welcome change. We have a regime, we have a government that is saying clearly the Hamas regime cannot remain in power in Gaza at the end of this war, immediately release the weapons that Israel needs to continue that, and through its diplomatic intervention was able to bring about that ceasefire agreement that has seen hostages returning to their families. I think this is an administration that understands the role of Israel as a regional power, as a regional ally for the United States, and sees that Israel's goal to defeat the Hamas regime that is still holding American hostages is an American interest and something that they want to promote instead of trying to, force Israel to go back to the reality that existed on October 6th, in which Hamas is still in power in Gaza, still threatening to invade and massacre our citizens.
Isn't what's really happened is that America and Israel are increasingly aligned on the view that the two-state solution is dead and that other things need to be created out of it?
Israelis since October 7th have grown much more skeptical of the so-called two-state solution. That's partly because on October 7th, Hamas massacred many supporters of the two-state solution. The villagers in the kibbutzim who volunteered their weekends driving Gazan children to hospital were burned alive and abducted on October 7th. So many supporters of a two-state solution are dead. And many others in Israel are saying, we pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005. We uprooted settlers. We pulled out the army in the hope that this territorial withdrawal would be a first step towards peace. And it exploded in our faces, and we got the Hamas jihadi regime that burned people alive on October 7th. Now, what's the West Bank? It's not a small piece of territory tucked in the corner of the desert. It's 20 times bigger than Gaza. It's a mountain range. It overlooks Tel Aviv. You can see the sea with your naked eye. It surrounds Jerusalem. It leaves Israel 9 miles wide. And Israelis are now saying, hang on, if we withdraw, while the Iranian regime is threatening more expansion and the destruction of Israel, while the Palestinians are still chanting from the river to the sea, then two-state is not going to solve the conflict. It's only going to make things worse. We're going to take what happened in Gaza on October 7th, and it will happen 1,000 times worse in the West Bank, because that is what Hamas is trying to do now. Hamas has been trying to take power in the West Bank, to build its terrorist cells in order to launch similar October 7th style attacks from the West Bank. And so Israeli society has become much more hawkish. People have become much less willing to take risks for peace, to make risky concessions, because they say, we just don't have the wiggle room. We did an experiment with Gaza when we pulled out in 2005. It exploded spectacularly in our faces. And whatever political accommodation we reach with the Palestinians in order to end this conflict is going to have to be based on Israeli security control west of the Jordan River. Because if Israel doesn't have ultimate security control, then jihadi groups will. And we can't allow that to happen.
The problem then is getting Arab neighbours to agree to that, because while President Trump might get on board with that thinking, there doesn't seem to be any clear sign that the Arab states surrounding Israel do.
I'm not sure I agree with that. Look, for many years, the whole Arab League had a single position. No peace with Israel, no recognition with Israel, no normalization with Israel until it solves the Palestinian issue. But then who got fed up? The Emiratis got fed up waiting for the Palestinians to make peace. The Bahrainis got fed up waiting for the Palestinians to make peace. The Moroccans got fed up, and they all signed the Abraham Accords with Israel in 2020, normalizing relations. We now have normal relations with the UAE. There are flights every day, more flights from Tel Aviv to the UAE than there are to London, because they understood that relations with Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, the biggest tech powerhouse in the Middle East, is a boon for them. It's good for them. And they're not going to wait for the Palestinians to give up their forever war, their forever jihad against Israel. And what Israel is hoping now is that the Saudis are going to do the same. They're not going to wait for the Palestinians to put aside this century-long war and make peace with Israel. They're going to say, the good thing for Saudi Arabia is peace with Israel. It's military cooperation with Israel against Iran. It's trade with Israel in order to normalize, in order to modernize Saudi Arabia's economy. And so instead of going inside out, starting with the trickiest conflict and then normalizing relations with the Arab world, the trend we're seeing is starting on the outside with the countries that have no territorial dispute with Israel, making peace with those first, and then you make your way in to the trickiest conflict.
Well, the key one there will be Saudi Arabia, and as yet they don't seem very enthusiastic about anything other than a two-state solution.
Well, we were on the road to normalization before October 7th. Part of the reason that Hamas launched the October 7th massacre was to try to scupper Israeli-Palestinian normalization. It's also part of the reason that the Iranian regime has been funding Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, is to try to throw us spokes in regional normalization. And so the Saudis are going to try to save face somehow, but for what it's worth, both the Trump administration and the Israeli government are pretty convinced that the Saudis are not going to insist on Palestinian statehood, and I'll tell you why. Because in the present circumstances in the Middle East, with the Iranian regime trying to sow chaos and instability, when you look at what they did in Gaza, when you look at what they did in Lebanon, when you look at what they did in Yemen, I think even the Saudis understand that any power vacuum, Iran is going to try to fill. And so a Palestinian state would become an Iranian client state, an Iranian puppet state, and that would go against Saudi Arabia's interests. They want stability in the region, and by taking on Hezbollah, taking on Hamas, paving the way for the fall of the Assad regime, Israel is showing its neighbors in the Middle East that it is a strong and dependable ally.
What happened to Stonewall and the gender activist movement in the UK? Julie Bindel and Simon Fanshawe talked to Natasha Feroz about the future of the charity.
What has happened to Stonewall in the past 5 years?
Obviously, Stonewall created what we call Stonewall law, which is a fallacy. They decided that gender identity would trump biological sex and legal sex in law, and that same-sex attracted people have to recognise that gender is more important than biological sex, and we weren't having any of it because same-sex attraction means lesbian or gay or bisexual people when they're involved with someone of the same sex. And if you were to have, for example, two women who identified as trans men and claimed they were in a gay relationship, a gay male relationship, that would clearly be utterly ridiculous. And similarly, if you have a straight man who's defining as a woman and says that he's attracted to women, that makes him a lesbian, which again is ludicrous. So Stonewall, for some years since Ruth Hunt took over from Ben Summerskill as chief executive, decided, and we can speculate as to why, it looked like at the time there was a lot of funding available for working on and lobbying for transgender rights. Since she came into office, she decided that we should accept that the T, which is a gender identity, not a sexual orientation, should not just join the LGB, but should supersede it in importance and pretty much everything else. And so increasing numbers of lesbians and gay men have protested this, have spoken out against it, have recognised that our rights are not being recognised, that our needs are not being met, and they have become, personally speaking, but I know for a lot of other lesbians and gay men, irrelevant to the lesbian and gay cause, but also definitely detrimental to it.
Simon, you were one of the co-founders of Stonewall years ago, and you must have seen it's changed dramatically since. How sad are you to see the state it's in now? And at the time of founding it, did you expect it to take such a direction?
No, I think one of the things about being in at the start of something is that you start it, you do your bit, and then you hand it over. So to some extent, I think the worst thing for me to do is, it wasn't like it was when we started it, because actually things never are. So they change, and that's fine. What I think is distressing, and I've always said this, this has been my constant critique really of Stonewall, is that if you look at the way in which Stonewall went about achieving what it ultimately did achieve, so 1989 to 2014, it went from a set of discriminatory laws mainly about men, but therefore affecting lesbians, to a position of equal marriage and therefore legislative equality. If you look at the way in which it did that, it did it by creating broad alliances of people around a big principle. And the big principle was not, we are fab, you must like us, you must do what we say, you must submit to our homosexual will. What we did was we said, actually, what we'd quite like to do is to establish equality so that lesbians and gays can contribute to a society that we can all live in. So we'd like to have the option to defend the country, join the military. We'd quite like to have the option to bring up children, foster, adopt. We'd quite like the option to participate in one of the building blocks of society, i.e. a legal recognition of our relationships. And what you can do around those bigger principles is you can draw in a very broad alliance of people. So that is what actually creates the change. What's happened since 2014 is that Stonewall has turned from building those big alliances into making kind of unilateral demands of people. And actually the problem with that is it's just bad politics, because in the end, and you can see it now, is that people just start to kick against it. So, people are by and large, I worked with a fire service the other day in my business, Diversity by Design, and we take scenarios and we give them scenarios, and then people get to discuss them on their small tables, and then we have a big discussion. And one of them involved the fact that one of the firefighters in this fire service has transitioned from female to male, male to female. And they wrote a letter to all their colleagues saying, look, this is what's happened, this is what I've done. And the sentence in the middle was, if you misgender me, don't worry. Just apologise and we can move on. What really interested me about hearing these people in the fire service, both the firefighters, they call them the Green Book and the Grey Book. So the Green Book is the professional services and the Grey Book is the frontliners. Grey Book and Green Book were both talking about, really, they were perfectly happy to find some way of accommodating this, of moving on, of working it out so they could still go on preventing and putting out fires. What they kicked against was being told to apologise. In other words, what they were kicking against was the imposition of a form of thinking, speech, whatever, with which they did not agree, and in some cases which they thought was quite simply an untruth. So the thing that surprises me about Stonewall is that if Stonewall had gone out and said, the thing about trans women is that they're trans women, there are really interesting stories here, and actually what we've got to do is find a way in which we can all participate in a society where we can contribute to our best, etc., etc., etc. Actually, people would have been up for that. But if what you do is start to impose what is effectively an untruth on people, I'm not just saying that people who are trans don't exist or anything like that. I'm merely saying is that a trans woman is not a woman. There are two distinct groups of people here. And if you impose the one on the other, people will resist it eventually.
And do you think, Simon, that the rot set in with this before they went completely bonkers on the trans train with the some people are gay, get over it, very aggressive style messaging that just rankled for many people? Yeah. What do you mean, get over it?
I'll tell you what I always think of. I always think of civil partnerships. The whole point about civil partnerships, so you'll remember this was the sort of precursor to equal marriage. I wasn't involved in the discussions except very tangentially. The point about civil partnerships was that without a legal relationship, you would not, as one half of a gay partnership or a lesbian partnership, be able to speak to your doctor and get information about your partner's health in hospital because you were not, strictly speaking, next of kin. You wouldn't inherit a house that you had lived in forever. It would go to your partner's parents if they had died intestate, and so on and so forth. Manifest inequalities. So what we needed was a legal relationship which would guarantee and require of us the rights and responsibilities that everybody else had. So if we'd gone for marriage, if they'd gone for marriage, if Stonewall had gone for marriage, they would not have got it because in the House of Lords, particularly the religious nominees in the House of Lords, think they own marriage, and they would have opposed it. It basically would have been defeated. But the point is, what were we trying to achieve? What we're trying to achieve was that legislative recognition of the relationship. And so civil partnerships are a really good thing to do. It was a clever way of a halfway house. So on one hand, then you had people sort of Peter Tatchell and those sort of activists saying this is marriage apartheid and nonsense. It was a way of achieving civil rights for people. And on the other hand, what you had was actually a very useful socialization. And I remember saying at the time, civil partnerships, everybody will call them weddings. And sure enough, you go to a civil partnership and there is still a 6-year-old skidding across the dance floor on their knees. There's still some grandchild dancing with granny. There's still two people who are happy with each other, at least until they get divorced. You know, it's all going well. And what people did was they started going, oh, it's like weddings. So when it came to equal marriage, people kind of got used to it. And that's how you achieve change. You achieve change by being in situations with people who change your life. And that is true for, when you change your views about race, whether you change your views about women, if you're a man, race, if you're white, you do it by being in contact with people. Do you know what I mean? So for me, the bonkersness was actually failing to what are we trying to achieve here? And therefore, what's the best way of doing it? The last thought, I think, is that I don't think the bonkersness is restricted to the whole argument around trans or whatever. I think there's a style of politics in there around identity and, the irony of people who say they're non-binary is they're the most politically binary people in the entire world. But there's a style of politics there that says that demands total agreement and separates you're for us or against us. So, sorry, last thought, but Ibram Kendi, the famous anti-racist writer in America who's just had to give up his research institute into such things, but nonetheless, his famous quote is, the answer to past discrimination is present discrimination. Now, I just don't think that's a politics which creates change. I think it creates resentment and kickback.
And I do think, I agree with you about the bonkersness and it being wider than the trans issue. I do think that the narcissism of some, not just young people that attach themselves to the organisation, but mainly young people who thought that they had a right to their own special identity, whether it's non-binary or aerosexual or whatever it was. And they started to bully, and we've seen this in other institutions. They started to lay down the law and to bully and to cast themselves as the eternal victim, but without any institutionalized victimhood that they could point to. So it was all about their own personal feelings. And when it started to be a no debate, get over it diktat, then that's when we as lesbians and gay men, some of whom felt that they should be represented by Stonewall, I was never keen, I have to say, that's when they started to push back and say, hang on a minute, we're not going to be told. This is our organisation. You're supposed to be there for us. And you're supposed to actually be there for groups of people such as lesbian and gay asylum seekers whose lives are in danger if they're returned back to whichever country they had to escape from. We're not going to be involved in this awful narcissism of the eternal victimhood.
The weird thing about it is how, the famous thing about the personal is political, invented by a lesbian collective in Boston, I think. But what they were saying was our personal stories are an important way of understanding what's happening in the bigger struggle, that they would have said. And you can see that if you go right back into post-war history, you can see historians who start to say, hang on a second, it's not all kings and queens. It matters what, the diary of Victoria Wood did that play, didn't she, about the diary of the woman at 36A or whatever it was, from mass observation. These personal stories matter. However, they matter as contributions to the understanding of these bigger conflicts. One of the things that seems to happen is that instead of the personal being political, the political became personal. it kind of got washed through a level of individuality and almost therapy. So you can see it in the well-being arguments. People say well-being at work. It's not about our well-being. It's not about safety for all or, conditions at work or whatever. It's my well-being. So you find this kind of individualism. And what's odd about that is it seems to me to come from right and left. It comes from hyper-individualism in the market, the idea of, the sort of Hayek-Friedman-esque sort of I'm an individual powerful in the market, which of course is nonsense. You're not. You're surrounded by all sorts of forces. But it also comes from another view, which ironically is from the left, which should be collectivist, actually seem to develop this hyper-individuality and as you call it, narcissism. So what's peculiar is that people then confuse. See, I don't care whether people call themselves asexual, non-binary. I really am not interested in whether, I don't mind. They can do what they like. If that's their way of expressing non-conformity, fine. The mistake is to transfer that personal, whatever it is, definition, transfer that into policy. Because the minute if you want to say, I'm non-binary, I'm neither male nor female, well, help yourself. But you can't impose that on the material reality of other people.
And it's exactly what Stonewall does when it lauds the message, bring your whole self to work. Oh my God, I can't think of anything worse. I can't think of anything worse. Do not bring your whole self. Bring your work self to work.
I've seen you in the pub.
Yeah,
no one wants to see that.
But the other in the pub, the idea of that. You bring a professional self, but you see what? So what is the root of this though? Because Stonewall definitely took on a kind of contemporary politics, which is lazy, very self-centered, and doesn't address kind of collective issues. And if, as you said, if they were addressing collective issues, they'd stop sending out emails at the moment that say, make the UK, tell Keir Starmer to make the UK safe for LGBTQ people, because it is. What they would be doing is saying, what we're trying to do is get people out of Afghanistan because the Taliban are going to, instead of queers for Palestine, that's actually what we're going to do is we're going to fight Hamas and stop them throwing gays off the roof and so on and so forth. But they don't have that sense of collective. So my question is, what happened?
Well, Ruth Hunt happened.
Orientation is too personal, and it's such a personal story. People then took that personal and tried to make policy out of it.
Well, and also Ruth Hunt happened. This is my take on it. She came in, she wanted a clean sweep. She wanted to make it very obvious.
This was the new chief exec in 2014.
In 2014, which obviously then she left. She's now in the House of Lords. Nancy Kelly took over. Any fewer brain cells, you'd have to water her twice a day. And she's now out and there's someone incoming and I can't keep up with it. However, Ruth Hunt was clearly chasing the money. She had told some of us that she wouldn't be adding the T to the LGP when she was looking to become chief exec during that interim period. And, some of us thought that might be the case. She might stick to her word, and others thought that she was definitely chasing that funding and also wanted to be very distinct from Summerskill, who was always against adding the T. Now, I think that what happened was she surrounded herself by this trans advisory group, all of whom will have just been feeling so powerful and buoyed up by the fact that they were dictating to everyone, they were setting policy, they were bullying everyone, they were getting women and men cancelled for daring to misgender. They really had a huge amount of power, and she could see that. And she would have been swayed by that to do their bidding effectively, and then that left the door open for others to come in and say, and I want to be recognised as aromantic, and I want my identity as an sapiosexual to have an entire document all about me, and she acquiesced to that.
Right. I also know a number of people who've been involved in trans equality, let's call it that, for a long time, who were explicitly excluded from that advisory group. So I often call myself, I say I'm the wrong kind of gay. And I have a mate who I work with from time to time, a trans woman who called Jackie Gavin. And Jackie calls herself the wrong kind of transsexual, because she was definitely, her narrative on being a trans woman is being a trans woman. She has a really interesting narrative about her relationship to the person she was before and so on and so forth. I'm sure that's right. I'm sure there was a kind of chase the money, but I think what's interesting is the money was there because, that there had been a conscious strategy, not just in the UK, but across, particularly in America, to pursue this idea of transsexuality, transhumanism, this idea of gender as opposed to sex. This has been bubbling away for a long while, hasn't it? And people latched onto it almost as if it was the next. I mean, this idea of trans people are the most victimized minority in society and so on and so forth, which, thank goodness, is not true. I mean, there's simply people aren't murdered in huge numbers or attacked in huge numbers. And in fact, they're barely attacked at all for being trans. So what I'm fascinated by is what happened in politics that meant that it became completely divisive. So instead of, I think I'm right and I think you're wrong in an argument, it's, I think I'm right and I think you're evil. That happened. So that dynamic changed. This individualism happened. And all of this centered on sex and gender particularly, although I think you can see it, as I say, in battles around race and my field, EDI, and so on and so forth. It became demanding in an unproductive way, very individualistic. But my question is, why were they stupid enough to do that? Because it constantly hasn't delivered. That's my point. I mean, you look at 2014 to 2024, the last decade, Stonewall has delivered no change.
Simon, this makes me think about how women have often responded to the gender ideology campaign. When I speak about this with lots of different groups, with gay men, lesbian women, and actually straight men as well, they all generally seem to be on board that gender ideology has got completely out of control, that there can only be two sexes. But then with straight women, a lot of them are in these charities and advocacy groups. And because they have quite an agreeable nature, they often have these caring roles. When they're told that a minority faces discrimination, they're compelled to want to help them at the cost of lots of other things.
Well, because they've been told, haven't they, that being trans-identified is a worse oppression than anything, that this is worse than the lesbians and gays went through with Section 28 or before that, because actually we have been through things worse than Section 28, but for some people that don't know their history beyond that. And that if they are heterosexual and they are not involved in any politics or community around lesbians and gay men, they will believe you if you tell them that being transgender is the worst oppression you can face. And therefore, they will also believe that this is the same as being lesbian or gay to one degree or another. The LGBTQIA+ that Simon famously said looked more like an unbreakable Wi-Fi code than any acronym that represents us. Then to them, it is all the same. So they're going to dictate back to us as lesbians and gay men, and to you when you talk to them about this, that do we not understand this is all part of the same community, and yet they haven't had their moment of liberation yet.
There's a couple of things, aren't there? There's one is, and I mean, look, I don't know this, but this is a narrative I've read a lot, which is that the sort of be kind notion is a huge appeal to the way in which women are emotionally socialized as you grow up. So so the narrative that I've read is that be kind notion, sort of building on you tell somebody, you say to a woman, somebody's oppressed, they will be, in a sense, socialized to kind of sympathize with that person. So look, I'm not a woman, I'm socialized in that way. So I mean, I bow to your superior judgment about that. But that's one element, I think, the be kind bit. And that, I think, generally plays across minorities. There is a kind of, the second point is there's a social cachet, the social value, social reward in being kind to minorities and being perceived to be kind. So, I mean, there's this phrase ally you have now in organizations. I don't like it, and I always try and critique it. I mean, I always feel like when somebody says, you have an LGBT ally, I always feel like I'm being wheeled across a rainbow pedestrian crossing in a wheelchair
and looked after, protected.
By a burly heterosexual man who's helping me out. Now, what you do need at work is, if to navigate your way around promotions and so on and so forth, you need advocates. And everybody I know who's ever achieved significant advancement to whatever level will say to me, "Oh God, it was fantastic. I had this boss. She was great. He was great." So you need advocates. But so this ally idea is very much, I think, is built on, again, this binary power notion that some people are oppressed and other people are oppressors. And that's a kind of unshifting idea. So the powerful, the oppressors, have to help the others. So I think there's a kind of mixture of stuff in there where straight women are drawn into that kind of stuff. But I think a lot of people, I find there's a lot of straight blokes who, have been sufficiently demonized, not individually, but as a group, this kind of bizarre notion of toxic masculinity, which is a sort of, people use it as if it's a tautology rather than a qualification, a subsection of masculinity. So when men get told they are the problem, rather than it being acknowledged that they have problems, what happens to men is that they need to find some way of looking nice, and looking sort of soft and liberal. And a great way of doing that, I mean, in the old days, it was some of my best friends are gay, some of my best friends are Jews, and if you were really lucky, you had a Jewish gay friend, and that was like 3 cherries. And, but you need that association, because otherwise people are going to say, "Oh, you're just a straight bloke." And all of this is distorted politics built around notions of identity, which don't represent the whole of people's life or experience or potential or talent.
Absolutely. And I think I know what Stonewall has done is it's never given weight to the double oppression that lesbians face, being a woman, the sexism, and then the turbocharged sexism from being an out lesbian. And the misogyny has been stepped over, because now we only have victims of misogyny are trans women. So in other words, men rather than women. They've stepped over us at a time when Stonewall should have been prioritising issues relating to lesbians. They then took the trans train on. And this is unforgivable, because they were never brilliant at advocating equally for women as they were men, for lesbians as they were gay men, in my view. And now what they've done is they've skipped over lesbians. They've demonized us. They are misogynistic, and they should fold. In my view, they are irrelevant now. We need a new organisation. We've got lots of organisations being set up, and Stonewall is now archaic and needs to go, in my view.
Certainly, there's a level of misogyny, I think, and you've seen it in gay male culture for a very long time. There is you can see it in the worst kind of drag, and I don't mean character acting of Barry Humphries and Lily Savage. I mean the kind of repetitive, imitative drag, which is essentially misogyny in a wig. That you can see it there. There's a level of racism. So I think gay men have to take some responsibility for this as well, because that we've not done enough over the years to challenge that culture, really. And I think we've contributed to it. And I think Stonewall, to some extent, it's embraced that embraced it. It's propagated it, I think, without thinking carefully enough about it, because you do find that, when there's that bloke with the beard, with the dress, who says that he's reframing the way in which you can be a lesbian. This is a video that was on the Stonewall site for someone. I mean, really, it's sort of laughable, really, because it looks like a comedy sketch, but actually he's behaving like a bloke who's sort of colonising the experience of lesbians. And you just think, get your tank off their lawn, frankly.
As my last note, I just want to say, though, I've been very thrilled and delighted at how many gay men are now recognising this and have stepped up to the mark and have decided that this is not acceptable. Lesbians have always been there for them, well, some, and they are now here for lesbians, and we do have a new alliance, which I'm really, really pleased about.
Debate around the Lucy Letby case heated up again this week. I'm joined by MP David Davis and Christopher Snowdon to discuss the case. This week, the MP David Davis chaired a panel of international medical experts who found that not a single one of the babies that Lucy Letby has been convicted of murdering died, by her hand. They found that either it was some other medical condition or there was some kind of medical negligence by the hospital or someone else. David Davis joins me now, along with writer Christopher Snowdon. David, why did you get involved with the case?
Well, in the first instance, I mean, I took a similar view, I think, to the one Christopher takes, which is, this woman was a monster who'd killed all these children and tried to kill others, so took no view on it. Then, just by sheer accident, I was waiting on a call from Mike Lynch. Remember Mike Lynch, the guy who died in the yacht? He had just won his court case in California, and I was waiting for a call from him just to talk about that. And I got this call from America. I thought it was him, and it turned out to be just somebody I know in New York who was suggesting I look at the New Yorker piece about the Letby trial. When I tried to get at it, it was blocked. There was a court order blocking it. And I eventually got it another way, but I thought, well, why the hell is it being blocked? So I raised it in justice questions the next day. And I would have thought no more about it. I mean, it got batted away, but I made the point. And then in the next week or so, in fact, in the next 2 weeks, to give you the sort of complete days, I got contacted by 16 different people, all of whom you would judge to be more authoritative experts than the people who actually took part in the trial. I mean, they range from past president of the Royal Statistical Society and a whole load of stats professors, some forensic medico-legal people, a number of neonatologists, a couple of nurses, one of whom had worked there, and so on. These were not your normal sort of mob of conspiracy theorists, which we've all got used to these days after a particular thing. And so I thought, well, I had to pay attention to this. And so I had a look and very, very quickly came to the view that it had been, for a variety of reasons, particularly the expert evidence that was accepted, so-called expert evidence, that it was a mistrial at least. But I was not at that stage. I'm now talking May, June. I was not at that stage persuaded that it was a miscarriage, because it's possible to get the right answer by accident, and that happens in British courts more often than we like to admit, I suspect. So I then spent the next few months trying to find what you might think of as a sort of I described it as a slam dunk, but basically a very clear piece of evidence that indicated that Letby had killed one child. I mean, I didn't need to find 7, and also talk to the experts I talked about. And broadly speaking, they were of the view that there hadn't been a murder, let alone that Letby was responsible. There actually hadn't been a murder, that these spikes were not that uncommon. In fact, in the year before, the year after, and the year in which the Council of Chester had this spike, there were 3 other hospitals had similar size spikes, measured in terms of deaths per 1,000 children. So I came to the view that this was likely to be a real miscarriage, and the reason I went through all that time is because I knew that once I actually engaged on this properly, it would become very time consuming, quite high stress. There'd be a fair amount of quite venomous responses online. I expected that. But for somebody to be put in prison for their entire life if it's wrong, I'm afraid it's worth doing it.
Chris, you're fairly staunchly of the opposite view that Letby is guilty, and that the jury and the appeal courts have already made the correct decision. David mentioned some of the statistical evidence that's got a lot of attention earlier on, and now obviously this supposedly new medical evidence. Why do you think David and his experts are wrong?
Well, I mean, there's a presumption of guilt, obviously, because she's serving 15 whole life sentences in prison for murdering and torturing babies. So, I mean, that would be a reasonable place for most people to start. I actually kind of came at this in a different way to David. I started off not knowing very much about it. I didn't really follow the case very much at the time, but I did. When I initially read about it, thought there was a chance this woman may be guilty, because it didn't seem a lot of what you might call strong, hard evidence against her. But I found that the more I read about the case, the more convinced of her guilt I became. The statistics has always been a huge red herring. It's really got nothing to do with statistics. It never has had anything to do with statistics. There was obviously a correlation between Letby being in the hospital every time a baby collapsed unexpectedly and or died. And the doctors noticed that, but that wasn't the reason she was convicted. It was the reason there was an investigation. And that investigation was very thorough, and several years later led to her being tried and convicted. But the statistics has got nothing to do with it. I've always said the thing that would make me change my mind about this is if you could get a very large group of scientists, relevant scientists, to say that, you know, Dowie Evans, the lead prosecution witness, doesn't know what he's talking about, nor do the other neonatologists, nor do the radiologist and the hematologist and all the other experts that came. And if it could be shown that, you know, this isn't how air embolism works, and actually there's an obvious way, obvious reason why these children died, that probably would be enough for the Court of Appeal. I mean, really, what they want to see is new evidence that exonerates her rather than just a difference of opinion. But if that difference of opinion was very, very widely held across a huge number of medical organisations, if the Royal College of Physicians and the BMA, for example, came out and said, look, we've looked at this and this is complete nonsense, then because the medical evidence is such a key part of the case, not by any means the only part, but a very important part, then you obviously have to look at it again. I just don't think that that's what's been achieved with this new panel. I don't think it has any chance, actually, of succeeding in the Court of Appeal. It's got half a chance of succeeding in getting the Criminal Cases Review Commission to push it to the Court of Appeal, but only because it might put some pressure on it, and particularly after the Andrew Malkinson case, which was a disgrace for the CCRC. They may feel that it will err on the side of caution and push it towards the Court of Appeal. But I really don't see how the Court of Appeal is going to have any time for it, because so much of it, and I don't think the people who produce this report realise this, but so much of what they're saying has already been tested in court. And the Court of Appeal is very intolerant of people repackaging up previous evidence and arguments and saying, we want you to have a look at this again. There's not enough new stuff in this report, and what is new is pretty conjectural, and some of it, as far as I can see, is plain wrong.
Well, let me just pick up a few points there, can I? Number one, the assertion that she was there for all of the deaths. Well, actually, there were 17 deaths. That's 15 more than usual.
That's not correct.
She wasn't even there for the majority of them.
There were 13 deaths, and she was there for 12.
Yes, it is. Let me, Christopher, I didn't interrupt you. I read your spiked article. It was amusing. About a dozen errors of logic and fact in it, but never mind. But let me just deal with that. I mean, she was said to be there for 6. She was said originally for 7. 1 they got wrong. They're still not sure, because the data they used, the access data, turned out to be exits rather than entrances. But by the by, let's accept 6. That means quite a lot she was not there for. Secondly, nobody, literally nobody, saw her do anything that amounted to the acts of murder that have been described. Thirdly, the person who presented the case in the press conference the other day is the man that Dowie Evans whose work is based on, namely that the one who wrote the original paper on air embolism. Unfortunately, Mr. Evans misread it. He misread the signals, the so-called Lee sign. He also misread it because it was about arterial air embolism, not about venous air embolism. And there are so many, there are a whole load of errors of this nature. One of the problems that strikes me as well, and I talked about this in Parliament, was that the accusers here, and by the way, they didn't check when they were on duty, the accusers here are people who are actually party to some of the mistakes. I don't say that these are even unusual mistakes, but they're party to the mistakes that led to the deaths of these children. And one of the difficulties we have here, apart from the failure of the expert system, I do not think Dowie Evans was a very plausible expert in this context. And the point of the 14 people we brought to bear a couple of days ago, they are more expert in most of the things that we were talking about. So they've got a problem with the way we deal with expert witnesses. Dr. Evans, or Mr. Evans, I'm not sure what he is at the moment with his license, was working for the police, paid by the police, technically has a duty to the court, but I'm not sure that he pursued that very well. So you got that problem. Secondly, you're quite right. The Court of Appeal is very loath to look at what it terms not evidence that's not new, even if the individual concerned, and let's leave this case aside, even if the individual concerned didn't deploy the evidence, made a mistake, their lawyers made a mistake, you can get condemned to life in prison if your lawyers make a mistake. They could be good lawyers and just still make a tactical mistake. I don't think that's justice, frankly. So there are two errors there, but the one that, over and above the miscarriage, the one that worries me most is that you got a hospital which has actually been responsible for the deaths of a disproportionate number of children. And I think bluntly recognizes itself it wasn't up to doing the job, because it downgraded its own rating the day it suspended Miss Letby from its job, from her job. So it hasn't touched a baby like most of these ones who died since those days, because it's not good enough. It doesn't have the skills, the resources, the number of properly qualified nurses, the number of highly qualified doctors that are necessary. One of the criticisms of it by the Royal College, and again, something that wasn't shown to the court at the time, one of the criticisms of it by the Royal College was that it only had once a week consultant rounds rather than one a day. Another criticism, not with the Royal College, but one that was leaked, was there was a Pseudomonas infection, which we don't know about. We don't know whether that had an effect or not, because we don't have the diagnostic data, but it's entirely possible. Dr. Lee said a couple of days ago in the press conference that there was another infection. It wasn't one I was familiar with, which was largely responsible for the death of one child. So a whole series of errors in this. And let me finally come to your point about the issue of probabilities. Now, the way a typical court runs is it starts with, and forgive me, but I'm boringly familiar with them for other reasons. The way a typical court runs is the prosecution makes its case, makes an opening speech. In this case, it was about 3.5 days from memory. And a large part of that was the table which showed 7 deaths, and the only person on for the 7 deaths was Lucy Letby. Now, that was clearly very persuasive. It was persuasive to the journalists watching. And so I assume, we can't know for sure, I assume it was pretty persuasive with the jury. And once you've established something like that, you do have a tendency to confirmatory bias in everything that follows. And we can talk through some of the rather doubtful bits of evidence if you like. But all of those things seem to me to be reasons to retry this, not to assume she's innocent, although I think she is. I think it's far, massively more probable, 100 times more probable. This was a failure of the system, not a failure, not a malice on her part. But it should be retried. That's what's needed here. Frankly, I would always hold whole life sentences open to appeal anyway, just in the same way in the States. Pretty much, it's almost automatic you get an appeal if you've got a death sentence. The most serious sentences should be open to it. But that's why I want to see it retried.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
And Chris, just before you come back on David's points, do you not accept that even if you're still pretty certain she's guilty, that there seems to be so much called into question about the case now that whether she's guilty or not, let's just do the trial again?
No. I mean, you can't have a retrial, especially one that lasted 10 months. You can't retry that just because some people think that there's something odd about the result, or they frankly don't understand what the case was about in the first place. It was a vast case made up a huge amount of all sorts of different pieces of evidence that I don't claim to have a full grasp on at all, but I still know a lot more than the vast majority of people have been talking about this. There needs to be some solid, preferably new evidence that exonerates this woman from at least one of the charges, and obviously she needs to get off all 15. And it's not going to happen with the kind of talk that we've been hearing on this, and indeed on Tuesday in the press conference. Why are these things happening in the press conferences anyway? Why don't they quietly put their evidence to the CCRC? I don't think Letby's lawyer even thinks this has much of a chance, quite frankly. I think the whole thing is about publicity and perhaps trying to change public opinion in advance of fresh charges, which he may well very soon be facing under Operation Hummingbird. Can I come back on some of what David has said? It doesn't really matter because it wasn't based on statistics. It was about the suspicious deaths rather than the total number of deaths. But as it happens, of the 13 deaths over this period, Letby was there on 12 occasions. And this doesn't depend on door swipe data. None of it did. There was no doubt Letby did not deny being, cotside or in the wards with these babies when they died, and there were obviously eyewitness testimonies too. If I may, I don't want to get bogged down in too much detail because a lot of people watching won't understand it. But just to give you an example of what I mean, take the case of baby D, who, by the way, was not premature and would still be admitted to the hospital even after it's been downgraded. She wasn't premature, but she was born with pneumonia. And she was being treated for pneumonia, and then she started having the sudden kind of collapses and recoveries. It was very common. It's weirdly common amongst many of Letby's victims. And on the final time she collapsed, she sadly died. And because she had pneumonia at the time, pneumonia was put down on the death certificate. This was then challenged by Dowie Evans and the other people who looked at the medical records. The whole theory was tested in court. Shuley's panel have come back, effectively doing a post-mortem without seeing the baby or speaking to any of the staff, and said pneumonia. Now, even if you think it was pneumonia, this has got no legs to stand on legally, because that question has already been asked and answered during the original trial. It's not going to be just relitigated just because some people think in a position largely of ignorance that there was something wrong with it. I'll give you one more example that is even more relevant. People seem to have forgotten. Only 2 months ago, less than 2 months ago, there was another press conference by Mark MacDonald in which Richard Taylor, another eminent neonatologist, stood up and he gave his theories as to how baby O died. He said that baby O died because a doctor had put a needle in the wrong side of his body, and he died of shock. He also then said that baby F, who had been poisoned with insulin, had not actually been poisoned with insulin. The tests were just wrong. And this went down very well with all the pro-Letby people, and they were saying, we must have a retrial, she's innocent, so on and so forth. Now, less than 2 months later, we have Dr. Shuley and his report saying that, no, this is, firstly, obviously not air embolism. I don't think any of them are air embolism, but it doesn't think it's the injection either. Apparently, this is now at least a third explanation is baby O had liver trauma from a traumatic birth, a traumatic delivery. He was born with a planned cesarean section. I know no evidence that there was any injury sustained, but that's their hypothesis, even though it's completely different to the hypothesis of MacDonald's previous expert, who now seems to have been written out of history, wasn't mentioned, nor are the two neonatologists that wrote the report. And the baby F, the insulin poisoning now the tests are right, but the readings were perfectly normal for a newborn. This is all over the place. The idea that this is going to succeed in court, I think, is ridiculous based on what we've seen so far.
Let's deal with baby O, shall we? Baby O had a bleed essentially into the liver sac. What include the sac, the organic sac that contains the liver, and right enough, as Taylor said, and if you ask Shuley, if you've been at the conference, you'd ask Shuley this, he would have confirmed it, that the doctor on duty, thinking that that there was too much air in the abdomen, splinting as they call it, put a needle in to the wrong side. He put it into the wrong side of the baby, and it went into the liver. All of that's in the notes. It's not a question of hypothesis. It's not guess. There have been thousands of pages of these notes that they've read, you haven't. And the simple truth is that baby, again, in the notes, had a 50% reduction in its hemoglobin levels. If you had that or I had that, we'd be in shock. I'm not quite sure what it does to a neonate, but we'd be in shock. So there's little doubt that it's got nothing to do with air embolism. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And again, what these doctors did, and these are very, very highly qualified doctors, far more qualified than Dr. Evans, I'm afraid. Each of them went through in pairs, separately, through each of these cases, all 17, in fact. Yeah, each of these cases, and if they came to the same conclusion, then you saw the summary. If they didn't, they'd have a third expert on whatever the difference was, come and look at it and help them arbitrate. This is not guesswork. This is going through the documentation around every child in a way which, and I've now been through the transcript as well as the daily accounts, does not appear to have happened in court. You've had assertions in court, but not the detail of everything. Well,
Court he did. How did he get on for 10 months?
And I'm afraid
it's got through an enormous amount of evidence.
They sat through 10 months and lots of commentary. But I don't think
I've been listening to a lot of transcripts.
Frankly,
a lot of them are available.
I recommend you go get yourself a copy of the transcript.
And if you read the transcript of, even if you just read the prosecution summing up, you can see that they discussed this theory about the injection in the liver. It was tested, evidence was given against it, and it was rejected. But that still doesn't address my point, which is not only has this stuff already been tested in court and therefore has no legs to stand on appeal, it's that even in the space of 2 months, the story has changed on this one baby. In fact, on two babies. Well, now it's birth trauma, not injection.
I don't agree with that. That isn't a change of the story. The key measure
no one disputes
is the drop in the hemoglobin
died
level.
as a result of injury to the liver.
That's far more dangerous.
It's how the injury came about.
Well, yes, they do. Yes, they do. Yes, they do dispute that. You say they don't dispute it? Well, she wasn't accused of murdering him by bleeding them to death or by causing a shock in the liver. She was accused of air embolism. So there is a complete difference of outcome. So there is a dispute there. You can't just walk around the evidence, I'm afraid, which is what you did in your Spike article, what you're doing today. And I think the truth of the matter is, when the CCRC sees it, we'll see the outcome. And if it goes back to appeal, we'll see real experts deliver their views on this, off the real facts, not off a theory which was designed around the police's...
Oh, this sounds rather conspiratorial now.
The police's requirements for a prosecution case. We'll also see, while we're at it, we will also see, I think, a fairly thorough view of how the police addressed this and how they attacked this case, including, for example, the fact that they hired a statistician to advise them on how they were putting together these accounts of when they were on and when they were off, or when various nurses were on and off, and how they and the fact they were advised by that statistical professor, very eminent professor in statistics, that they were doing.
I've heard her talk about this case.
They were doing it the wrong way. No, some of them weren't, I'm afraid. They were doing it the wrong way. They're doing it the wrong way. And what happened? The prosecution lawyer said, drop that statistician.
David Spiegelhalter, who is genuinely an eminent statistician, gave evidence to the Thorwall inquiry and showed how pointless it would have been to bring statistics into this case whatsoever.
I recommend your viewers read the evidence from Spiegelhalter. It doesn't help your case very much.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time, so we'll, as you say, we'll leave the readers to look at the evidence on their own time. And finally, Michael Gove, Katie Bowles, Patrick Maguire, and Gabriel Pogrund discuss Labour's path to power and how Keir Starmer is getting on.
Now, thank you both for joining Spectator HQ today. We're here to talk about your book, Get In. Patrick, the last one was left out, which is also obviously about Labour not making it to power. How is it different going about it this time?
Well, we did initially try and convince our publishers to call it Right-In, but they thought the concept of a right of the Labour Party was slightly too convoluted for the big table browser at Waterstones. It's been a very difficult process. Because last time we were different, and in some respects difficult, because last time we were writing the post-mortem of a project that had failed. The entirety of Jeremy Corbyn's kitchen cabinet and the broader left were sat at home with nothing to do, sat on their computers with lots of documents to leak and grudges to litigate with us. This time we have been, for the best part of a year, actually a year exactly, from the first interview to the proof going to print, we've been speaking to people who at various points have been preparing for government and just getting to grips with government. And when a party's in the ascendant, that sort of level of candour and frankness has been difficult to obtain in some respects, and people have been cagier, but I think we managed to crack it in the end.
Yeah, I think you've done a pretty good job there. And when you look at the serialisation, various disclosures so far, the idea that Starmer's closest aide thinks that he is a caretaker, so HR manager type figure, and then also I think looking at inside the Sue Gray story. And of course you've also caused a row over lockdown. Gabriel, can you talk us through that story?
I can, and I don't want to break through the fourth wall too much over here, but I'll give you the Spectator an exclusive. It was entirely inadvertent on our behalf. I'll pay credit to the editor of the Sunday Times who was examining the tome and identified this detail that Starmer had received the help of a Shakespearean actress to improve his performance and delivery, Leonie Mellinger. She'd starred opposite Laurence Olivier in the past, and Starmer came calling in 2017, and my editor was just keen to learn a little more, and so I contacted Leonie only a week ago. I mean, we literally have one sentence dedicated to her in the book, but what she divulged and a picture she happened to supply has unwittingly ended up fueling this allegation that she broke lockdown, that Starmer himself may have fallen foul of some of the COVID restrictions. So we're entirely blameless in this. We wish we could say that we had in any way conceived of the number one scoop in our own book. but
almost buried.
But it had nothing to do with us.
We thought when we put it up on Saturday evening, when the rest of the serialisation went up, we thought, there's some of this will make difficult reading for Downing Street, but at least this nice story about Keir Starmer finding his voice and, this woman who has lots of nice things to say about him, that'll take the edge off. Little did we know that one throwaway line in it would cause, give CCHQ something to do for the best part of a week. So there we are.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
But one of the things about this book, which I very much enjoyed reading, is that there are so many golden nuggets that you've prospected for, so many diamonds that you've mined, that inevitably people reading this book will find within it, as with the Leonie Mellinger story, all sorts of ways of either potentially causing trouble, but certainly better understanding Starmer, his team, and the government. Because on almost every page, as a reader who obviously takes an interest in politics and having practiced it myself, I'm fascinated by the personality stories, but it gives you a depth and richness to understanding the tensions within the Starmer project that we've seen played out over the course of the last 8 or so months that they've been in government. So some of the things that may perplex the outsider are better explained once you appreciate, at least two key things about Starmer. One is that he is dedicated to winning at all costs, and the second is that while he makes mistakes, he learns from them in order to pursue that victory at all costs strategy.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think he's at once an infuriatingly slow learner, in that he is, throughout this story, often the last person to reach obvious conclusions that his more political aides and intimates have come to months and months before. But once he comes to that conclusion, the correction is swift and it's brutal. Look at what happened to Sue Gray. I mean, you, a man of your erudition, Michael, will have noticed the epigraph, the famous Jeremy Thorpe line on the Night of the Long Knives, lay down his friends for his life. And you see that happen again and again and again. And it's that sort of, as you say, winning at all costs. And there is no mistake. There are no lengths he won't go to correct a mistake and learn, even if that means, throwing friends under the bus. And, people might say that's personally a not particularly admirable quality. But in a politician, it's that sort of remorseless, remorseless approach to politics that has served him quite well.
One of the things that comes out is that Starmer was the perfect candidate at the time after Corbyn fell, in that he had credentials on the left, which were sufficient to reassure the idealists, but he had an establishment pedigree in office, which meant that realists could see him as a plausible prime minister. But initially, as the book makes clear, he wanted to be friends with everyone. He wanted the old Corbynistas to fold their tents and join him. But he's forced to a realisation that he has to kill Corbyn and he has to terminate the Corbynista influence in the party. And the person who secured him the leadership, Morgan McSweeney, was the person who knew that always had to happen. But as you say, it took some time for Starmer to come to that recognition, as he did to subsequent recognitions.
That's quite right. I mean, there's this very filmic moment in the book where McSweeney gathers the great donors of the Labour Party's moderate wing and presents to them this slideshow, Operation Red Shield. It's almost as though it was all prepared to be subjected to proper history in due course. But in this, he identifies that Labour is composed of these coalitions to which you refer, the ideologues of the hard left, the people who McSweeney thinks Labour can do without. But then you have these two other wings, the instrumentalists, those who we'd characterise as being Blairite, who will always choose the most pragmatic course, and then the idealists, who have long been the kind of kingmakers within the Labour Party. These are the people who just want the world to be a little nicer. You know, they weep about the plight of refugees. They think the economy ought to be more fair. And McSweeney said to Starmer, you need to win them and you need to patch them and the instrumentalists together, and that will endow you with control over the party. And I think that one of the things we learn about Starmer is he is pretty studiously disinterested in the stuff of politics and the Labour Party selectorate. He's happy to deliver a message, you know, laser focused on that demographic. And it is only really after the Hartlepool by-election that Starmer is forced to consider whether there is another coalition, a more important coalition, one out there in the country that he needs to orient himself towards. And actually, it was as late as 2021 that he was texting Owen Jones, you know, telling him he was better than that. Owen, you're better than that, when he was being accused of dragooning the party over to the right. I mean, he was sensitive to this accusation, and as Patrick alluded to, when he changed his mind, he is pretty decisive, and it was when he was staring his leadership, when he had this reckoning after 2021, that he then decisively shifts away.
And having secured such a sort of landslide victory, following his recognition of the logic of the McSweeney approach, the need to win back, in particular, hero voters, working class voters in the Red Wall, then it seems as though the first few months of the administration are wasted. In fact, are a series of setbacks and unforced errors. That can't all be blamed on Sue Gray. What lessons do you think Starmer has learnt from those few months, and what influence do you think Morgan McSweeney is now having on any new direction for the government?
I think you can see now that this is a more political, has a much clearer political sense of self. Now, you can ask questions about whether the growth agenda, what Starmer says about migration now, how that fits together, and how it, you know, whether it's credible for the Keir Starmer of 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But clearly, Morgan McSweeney has politicised this government and given it a clearer sense of political identity. I mean, the first 100 days is one of the mysteries I think we haven't quite solved, because there are, as you say, there's a big and victorious body of opinion in Number 10 who blame it all on Sue Gray, and it's clear that she bears a lot of the responsibility. But ultimately, the book has to stop, or the book will also stop with Keir Starmer, I think. But, you know, the book stops with Keir Starmer because, as much as there are people who'll say Wahid Ali, whose largesse caused so much damage in those days, was a Sue person, he was also a Keir person. You know, Morgan McSweeney and Sue Gray were both Keir Starmer people. And it's certainly true that as early as January, we were having conversations. January 2024, we were having conversations with people who were saying this Sue thing is a complete disaster. It'll never work in government. Ideally, we'd like to get rid of her now. And there was, for some people, the need to see the first 100 days go badly so Sue Gray can, in effect, be constructively dismissed. I think that's one of the things that happened. So it's almost by accident and by design. I think those first 100 days were bad. And also, it's on Keir Starmer for sort of not really noticing that the office he'd set up wasn't working much longer than, much earlier than than the 4th of July 2024.
And I must just, if I might just briefly develop that, I mean, one of the episodes in the book we've examined is the Arlington group phase. This was in 2019 when Starmer was every Monday morning furtively going to the home of Jenny Chapman, his parliamentary colleague, to plot the path to power with a close group of confidants, and it was all very seditious. They'd trot into Parliament one after another so as not to be caught. But we spoke to an attendee of that first meeting who said that not only did Starmer not want to chair it, but he also didn't want to discuss the politics of his proposed bid. This was months before the reckoning of December, but he wanted to make sure that they had fully gotten on top of the campaign finance rules and the regulations, and he wanted to ensure that somebody was taking notes. And I think that something we learned during writing the book that surprised us was that notwithstanding all of that and what those around him say is a detail-oriented approach towards politics, quite a procedural approach towards politics, when he won that election and headed into Downing Street, I mean, the cupboard was bare in terms of the plan. And I think we're shocked and not quite sure exactly how it came to pass that there was no grid for that first 100 days. I know it's one of the cliches of politics. As long as the grid's full, then everything's going to be fine. And there is more to life than the grid. But to have learned, as we have, that Starmer's tour of the nations was planned on the back of a fag packet because the person who did it didn't know whether they would themselves have a job, this being the Director of Communications. I mean, there's a sort of tension between the first version of Starmer, the stickler for detail, and then the Starmer of 2024.
An inevitable question is, what does Starmer really want to do with his majority? So he wants to win. He wants to win on the football field. He wanted to win in the courtroom. He wants to win this election and win control of the Labour Party and now the country. What for?
It's a really, really interesting question. And it's one we came a little bit closer to answering with the help of Peter Hyman, who obviously wrote the Prime Minister's 5 missions. Don't know if we still speak about those on Whitehall, but there you go. And one of the things Peter Hyman said to us, on the record in his own words, was that Keir Starmer's a very experiential politician, i.e., he comes to opinions hard and fast after seeing them. The example he gives is children going under general anaesthetics have their teeth out. But that, even saying that aloud now, that's not the same as a political philosophy. That's not a vision for the country he wants to run and shape in his own image. And I think it's fair to say that his politics, or a sense of Starmerism, is a felt absence throughout this book. Beyond the acquisition of power and beyond the Labour Party winning, which, by the way, as we all know, is part of the Labour's intellect, that sense of Labourism for its own sake, the Herbert Morrison socialism is what a Labour government does thing. But we don't really know what he wants to do beyond the sort of, let's have an effective Labour government. It's tricky. And, the man himself, we quote him saying there's no such thing as Starmerism and there never will be. So, that is himself saying that. So it's tricky.
And on that, Patrick, do you think that as government has become difficult, Keir Starmer is developing more of a sense of politics, what he wants to do, or do you think he's just absorbing what Morgan McSweeney and his supporters want to do?
I think if you look at what comes out the Prime Minister's mouth, much of it is from political aides like Morgan McSweeney and those close to him. Look at what he's now saying on migration. Very assertive, very robust language on the Tories failing on migration, that sort of thing. What he's saying on growth, that comes from Rachel Reeves. What is the Prime Minister himself saying that he gets up in the morning and he knows exactly instinctively what he says? Well, weirdly, it's the bits that are in deliberate conflict with other bits of the agenda, by which I mean the ECHR, which, you hear whispers from people in and around Downing Street that there has to be a reckoning on that if they're going to tackle small boats properly. The Chagos Islands, look at that as well. But, not to cite another author on Keir Starmer in an interview about our book, but Tom Baldwin, that's Keir Starmer's biographer,
Great writer.
Great writer, and he knows Keir Starmer very, very well.
Slightly different book.
A slightly different book, but it's people should read them together because you get a fuller sense of Keir Starmer the man, I think, from that book. But he says, Keir Starmer's politics are the ECHR, and
why are half the cabinet and people in Downing Street having a pop at the Attorney General right now? Because he is also Mr. ECHR. He is Mr. International Law. So we do have some sense of what Keir Starmer believes. The big question is, that is authentic Keir Starmer, and the other bits are instrumental Keir Starmer, i.e. the stuff Keir Starmer is saying because he knows that that's what political people think will make his government a success. What wins out in the end, we don't know.
And Gabriel, from having done a year of interviews, I think Patrick has touched on some of the current tensions, but what do you think the future tensions for the next few years of the Labour government are going to be?
I'm going to say...
Lisa Nandy.
Well, if you want me to crowbar in what I'm led to believe is Michael's favourite line of the book, there is a moment shortly before Starmer became leader in which Morgan McSweeney said that Nandy had no chance of leading the party, and he derided her politics as being no gender, no queen, no borders. So that's a lovely trifecta, which I think distills everything that Morgan McSweeney isn't about politically. When you ask about what some of the tensions could be, I do think the cover of our book features Starmer and a mask of his face, and I think there is this question as to which Keir Starmer prevails in a given moment. I mean, there is the sort of Blairite tendency within him. There's Tony Blair uttered the line that what works is what gives effect to our values, or something along those lines. In essence, this idea that Starmer is happy to zig and zag if the ultimate outcome is victory and then being able to do things, and he always chafes against this idea that he has to commit to a given path, and so he's quite flexible. But then there are moments where he is utterly unbending, and actually there are so few of them in the book that when they happen they really are conspicuous by their presence. There's this particular moment in the aftermath of October the 7th. One of our fine sources endowed us with the entire WhatsApp of conversations within the leader's office after those appalling attacks, and it was in the days after that a number of his inner circle were saying, well, we need to convey more empathy with the Palestinians. David Lammy, now Foreign Secretary, said that Emily Thornberry had been given a real roasting the previous night on Newsnight because the party hadn't really refined its position on the destruction unfolding on the other side of the border. And I suppose there is always this critique of books like ours that they view history through the prism of advisors. Naturally, we are to some degree dependent on those who talk to us, but this was really one of those moments where that correspondence was insufficient, because it was very clear that nothing was going to change, because Starmer himself, having spoken to Merav Michaeli, the leader of the Israeli Labour Party on the day of the attacks, he was in a bomb shelter. Patrick used this word, experiential. When Starmer experiences something, when he sees something, kids at Alder Hospital, speaks to somebody in a bunker, he just becomes a conviction politician and becomes utterly animated. And this was one of those moments. It was fascinating for us because gone was I'll subcontract policy and politics to McSweeney or whoever else. And you have this Starmer of conviction. And I would be interested in the course of the next 5 years when we see that.
It is interesting you mentioned Tom Baldwin's book earlier, and in Tom Baldwin's book he talks about Starmer as Director of Public Prosecutions meeting the parents of a victim and becoming evangelical on their behalf in a way that the young Starmer as a natural defender rather than prosecutor would have found dislocating. You mentioned also the way in which you got so many people to talk to you. What was their motivation? So why do you think you've been so successful in having people who have so many fish to fry in government who've taken time out to spill the tea with you?
Look, I think ultimately, however inconvenient aspects of this book will be for Number 10 and those who run it, they have in this book bent the arc of history towards doing something very few leaderships of the Labour Party do, which is win an election handsomely and convincingly. So that's all. People always want those stories told. There are also those, obviously, who have been royally screwed over by this Labour leadership, who wanted to talk to us. But I think if people have read our last book on Jeremy Corbyn,
we were surprised in the days and weeks after that lots of people on the left who would have otherwise been very suspicious of us says actually that was a very fair and reasonable piece of work. So I think people knew we were approaching this with a degree of seriousness, no matter how uncomfortable the serialisation headline is. And, if you ask the right questions and are furnished with the right information, people are always better served talking than not. I hope they talk to us again, at least after a little bit of time.
Might be a bit of a timeout.
But, I think there is grit in the oyster of this story, but ultimately, how would you describe it in a sentence? I think Matt Chorley's quote on the back cover is probably apposite. Apposite. How one man rose from obscurity and took to run the country and took Keir Starmer along for the ride. If you are a fan of Morgan McSweeney or work with Morgan McSweeney, okay, it's a little bit insulting to Keir Starmer, but look, it's basically true.
On the subject of fairness and accuracy, I mean, Michael, you make an appearance in the book, so would you say that it was true to life?
Completely. So one of the many scoops, this is probably a micro scoop given how many big scoops there are.
Very humble.
Is the fact that I had dinner with the aforementioned Morgan McSweeney before the election at the home of a mutual friend who must remain anonymous. I explained to him that in the election forthcoming I would have to be incredibly vicious towards Keir Starmer and rude about those around him. But I found Morgan McSweeney in that conversation, as I think so many people have, modest and unassuming in manner, but implacable and determined in his desire to make sure that he could understand, in my case, how government worked from the inside, just as he'd learned previously how an election-winning machine should work.
Is there going to be a third book?
Well, some people have generously volunteered to resume our conversations for the third book. So I suppose if people are, amassing information and wanting to talk to us for a third book, it would be rude of us not to. I mean, ultimately the decision is that of Penguin Random House, but we hope we have fulfilled the terms of our contract adequately, that they would reconsider us.
What do you think the title might be?
I don't know. You might want to bleep this out, but someone did suggest "fuck off."
We've also got "get out."
Get out.
If that's what the British people's instruction is.
And with that, thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Gabriel, for appearing today.
That's all for this week. Don't forget to subscribe, tap the bell, and leave your feedback in the comments. See you next week.